Hey there, welcome to True Crime Records. Tonight, we're stepping into the shadowed world of organized crime. Not the world of loud shootouts and public executions, but the quieter, far more dangerous world of power, patience, and invisible control. This is the story of a man who ruled without showing his face, that a man who built an empire without ever becoming its target, that a man who lived at the very top of America's criminal underworld and somehow died peacefully in his own bed. Tony Accardo. For decades, his name barely appeared in headlines. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't reckless. He didn't crave attention. While others rose fast and fell violently, Accardo moved slowly, carefully, always behind the curtain. Law enforcement chased him for half a century and never truly caught him. This is not the story of chaos. It is the story of quiet dominance, of strategy over impulse, of control without spectacle. Over the next 15 chapters, we'll trace the rise of the man who outsmarted rivals, betrayed kings, reshaped the Mafia from the shadows, and walked through a lifetime of danger without ever being taken down. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. This late-night true crime family stretches across the world, and I'm glad you're here. Now settle in, let the day fade, and follow me into the silent power of a man who never needed to be seen to rule. This is True Crime Records, and if you're new here, make sure to subscribe. There's a new story waiting for you every night. Chapter 1. A boy from the streets, long before anyone whispered his name in fear or respect, before power gathered quietly around his decisions. Tony Accardo was just another child growing up in a city that demanded toughness from the moment you learned to walk. Chicago in the early 1900s was alive with motion and struggle. Smoke from factories hung low over brick neighborhoods. The streets were packed with immigrant families chasing the idea of a better life, and packed just as tightly with broken dreams, gang rivalries, and unseen dangers. It was a city where opportunity and violence lived side by side, and where survival often mattered more than rules. Tony grew up in this world without privilege. There were no safety nets, no gentle paths forward. From a young age, he learned what many boys in his neighborhood learned, that respect was not given freely, and that weakness rarely went unpunished. But unlike many others, Tony did not learn this lesson through loud rebellion or reckless defiance. He learned it quietly. He watched. He listened. He observed how power behaved long before he ever touched it. While other boys struggled to be noticed, Tony blended into the background. He was not known for wild temper or public bravado. He was known for something far rarer: composure. Even as a teenager, he carried himself with a calm that felt unusual for someone his age. He did not speak more than necessary. He did not explain himself. And he never rushed into danger without understanding it first. The streets taught him early that noise attracted consequences. Loud men drew attention. Attention drew enemies. And enemies, in that world, rarely stopped at threats. Tony began to understand that survival did not belong to the strongest fist. It belonged to the sharpest mind. By his early teens, crime was already part of his daily environment. Small thefts, delivery jobs that paid in silence rather than cash. Watching older boys disappear for weeks and return with money they could not explain. Watching others return with bruises. Some never returned at all. Every disappearance added another invisible lesson to Tony's education. What separated him from most was not hunger for chaos, but hunger for understanding. He studied who failed and who endured. He noticed that the loudest men often fell first. He noticed that the quiet men stood closest to the power without ever exposing themselves to it. And slowly, that was where Tony positioned himself, close enough to learn, far enough to survive. By the time Prohibition arrived and transformed crime into a business empire, Tony was already prepared. Alcohol turned street gangs into corporations and alleyways into supply routes. Men who once fought for blocks now fought for cities. Everywhere money moved, violence followed. But so did opportunity for those who understood patience. Tony did not rise by force. He rose by repetition, by dependability, by becoming the man who always followed through. When he was told to wait, he waited. When he was told to move, he moved without hesitation. And when others spoke, Tony remained silent. That silence became his first real weapon in a world where fear was currency and loyalty was tested constantly. Tony built a reputation not as a killer, but as something far more dangerous, a man who could be trusted. And in organized crime, trust was more valuable than a gun. Slowly, doors began to open that no street-level thief was supposed to enter. Backrooms, meetings after meetings, conversations that stopped when strangers approached. Tony was never invited loudly. He was simply expected to be there, and he always was. By the end of his teenage years, the streets no longer saw him as a boy. They saw him as someone who belonged to the machinery that was quietly taking over Chicago. The transformation happened not through explosions of violence, but through steady presence, through reliability, through the kind of patience that makes people underestimate you. Tony Accardo had not yet reached power, but power had begun to notice him. By the time Tony reached his late teens, Chicago was no longer just a city to him. It had become a living map of influence, boundaries, and invisible ownership. Every street belonged to someone. Every corner had a set of rules that were never written down, but always enforced. And every successful man had either learned those rules or broken them carefully enough to survive. Tony learned them. He entered deeper into street-level crime, not as a thrill seeker, but as a student. He ran errands that required silence. He moved between locations that were never discussed in public. He stood outside rooms where decisions were made that would shape neighborhoods for years. And in those quiet moments, waiting outside doorways, sitting in parked cars, standing in hallways, he absorbed the rhythms of power. He watched how leaders spoke less when their authority was strongest. He watched how fear traveled before orders ever did. He watched how loyalty was rewarded, but also how it was tested. What fascinated Tony most was not how men rose, but how they fell. The city was full of men who had once ruled with reputation alone. Their names had spread quickly. Their tempers were legendary. Their violence was public. For a time, they were feared. And then, without warning, they vanished. Sometimes through prison doors. Sometimes through hospital doors. Sometimes through neither. Tony never laughed at their downfall. He noted it. He saw a pattern forming, a quiet truth that few acknowledged out loud. The men who survived longest were not the loudest. They were the ones who knew when to retreat, when to disappear, and when to let others take the spotlight. Power, he began to realize, was not something you displayed. It was something you positioned. As prohibition reshaped crime into a massive underground industry. Tony found himself surrounded by men chasing speed over strategy. Money moved fast. Alcohol moved faster. Violence followed close behind. Entire empires were being built almost overnight. And just as many were collapsing under their own arrogance, Tony stayed steady through it all. That he never chased headlines. He never challenged leaders in public. He performed exactly the role given to him, and he performed it flawlessly. That made him useful, and usefulness, in that world, led to protection. Older figures began trusting him with heavier responsibilities, larger money runs, more sensitive operations, tasks that required absolute discipline. And Tony never failed them. He never talked. He never panicked. He never disappeared without reason. Trust deepened, and with trust came proximity. Tony was now close enough to see the machinery of organized crime not as myth, but as business. The ledgers, the routes, the informal contracts sealed with handshakes instead of documents. The quiet rules that governed when territory could expand and when it could not. It was here, standing closest to the engine of power, that Tony made one of the most important decisions of his life. He would never be the man in the spotlight. He would never be the loud voice in the room. He would never let his ego outrun his strategy. Instead, he would become the man whose absence would be noticed only when everything began to fall apart. This philosophy shaped everything that followed. Even as violence escalated across Chicago, Tony's way remained quiet. He did not initiate chaos. He moved within it with precision. He learned how to balance respect with distance, how to appear loyal without becoming replaceable, how to fulfill expectations without binding his fate to any single ruler. And this made him different. Where others collected enemies as quickly as they collected power, Tony collected patience. He let others rise quickly. He let them draw attention. He let them burn bright. All while he prepared to outlast them. By the time the city entered one of its most volatile criminal eras, Tony had already secured something that could not be bought with money or fear, an invisible reputation. The kind that opens doors without knocking. The kind that protects you without warning you first. the kind that survives even when leadership changes. Tony Accardo was no longer a boy learning the streets. He had become part of the structure itself, quiet, reliable, unseen, and the final piece of his transformation was about to arrive. By the time Tony crossed into his early 20s, the streets no longer tested him the way they once had. He was no longer proving himself. He was being counted on. That difference was subtle to outsiders, but inside the underworld, it meant everything. He was trusted with timing, with money, with silence. These were not small things. These were the foundations of power. Tony's rise did not come with celebration. There were no public acknowledgments, no formal announcements. His advancement happened the way most real power does, quietly, behind closed doors, in conversations that never left the room. He was given access not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it through years of consistency. And consistency created something stronger than feared. It created reliance. Older men began to lean on him for precision. When things needed to run smoothly, Tony was the name that surfaced. When disputes needed to be settled without unnecessary noise, he was called. When a task required judgment instead of impulse, he stood nearest the decision. He had become the kind of man others trusted with the weight they did not want to carry themselves. But with access came danger. The closer Tony moved to the core of organized crime, the more he saw how fragile leadership truly was. Every man at the top was surrounded by rivals pretending to be allies. Every leader was one mistake away from losing everything. And most of them made that mistake eventually. Too much pride, too much noise, too much hunger for control. Tony learned what not to become by watching those men fail. He saw how ambition exposed them, how impatience betrayed them, how violence, when used too loudly, invited consequences that could not be avoided. And through all of it, Tony refined his own philosophy. He would never rule through fear alone, that he would never enjoy power for its display. And he would never forget that every position of authority came with an expiration date. Unless you learned how to exist beyond it, the first true test arrived quietly. It did not come in the form of a public confrontation or violent challenge. It came through loyalty, through a moment when he was asked to choose between safety and obligation, between comfort and commitment. The details were never recorded, never spoken of publicly, but those within the circle understood what it meant. Tony chose commitment, and in that choice, he crossed the invisible boundary that separates participants from pillars. From that point forward, there was no going back to being just another trusted worker. His fate was now bound to something larger than himself. The world he once observed from the edges had closed around him. And instead of resisting, Tony adapted. He did not change who he was. He simply became more of it, more composed, more patient, more precise. The violence of Chicago escalated around him. Rivalries deepened. Empires expanded. Law enforcement tightened its focus. But through it all, Tony remained largely untouched. His name rarely surfaced. His movements remained quiet. His influence continued to grow without announcement. People who failed around him often did not understand why Tony never seemed to fall with them. The truth was simple. He was never chasing the same rewards. Where others chased legend, Tony chased longevity. Where others chased power, Tony chased survival. By the end of his early adulthood, Tony Accardo was no longer just part of organized crime. He had become something far more enduring, a figure evolving into permanence. And Chicago, restless and loud as ever, had not yet realized what kind of man it was allowing to rise beneath its noise. Chapter 2. The Shadow Behind the Throne. By the late 1920s, Chicago no longer belonged to the city itself. It belonged to money, alcohol, and men who understood how to control both. Prohibition had turned crime into industry. What had once been scattered street operations were now vast, organized networks moving liquor, bribing officials, and shaping entire neighborhoods through fear and fortune. The city moved to the rhythm of illegal business. Police sirens became background noise. Gunfire became punctuation. And power changed hands as fast as the tide. At the center of it all stood a king. Al Capone ruled Chicago openly. Newspapers carried his name as if he were a celebrity. Politicians avoided challenging him. Rival gangs feared provoking him. He was loud, unapologetic, and everywhere at once. To the public, he was the face of organized crime. But behind every visible king stands a quieter force, and that force was beginning to take shape in the form of Tony Accardo. Tony did not compete with Capone for attention. He didn't need to. While Capone built a reputation with spectacle, Tony built his with steadiness. He was moving deeper into the structure without ever becoming the structure's face. The difference was crucial. Capone's power depended on fear. Tony's power began to depend on trust. As the criminal empire expanded, operations grew more complex. Supply chains stretched farther. Bribes grew larger. Risks became deadlier. Every new connection was another thread that could unravel everything. And in that world, the most valuable people were not the loud leaders, but the ones who could be trusted to keep the machine running without shaking it. Tony became one of those people that he moved between operations without disrupting them. He carried messages that needed to be delivered without error. He supervised movements that required timing more than force. No one questioned his presence. No one doubted his loyalty. And because he never drew unnecessary attention, no one outside the inner circle noticed him at all. This invisibility became his armor. As violence escalated across the city, many rising figures embraced it as proof of control. They mistook chaos for strength. Their names grew loud. Their enemies grew louder. And one by one, their stories ended in gunfire or handcuffs. Tony watched it all with discipline. He saw how noise invited pressure, how reputation attracted investigation, how ego shortened lives. And so he remained quiet. The more chaos surrounded him, the calmer he became. While others collided with law enforcement, Tony learned how to avoid it almost entirely. He studied how investigations began, how witnesses were built, how mistakes traveled backward through chains of command. He didn't learn these things from books or courtroom records. He learned them from watching men make fatal errors, and he never repeated those errors himself. In time, people began to realize that Tony did not merely survive the turbulence of the Prohibition era. He moved through it untouched. Operations he supervised ran smoothly. Associates who worked under him stayed loyal. Problems handled by him vanished without headlines. He was becoming something rare, a stabilizer in an unstable world. And stability, in organized crime, was worth more than intimidation. While the city roared around him, Tony Accardo grew stronger not by conquering territory, but by mastering restraint. And as the empire expanded beyond what any single man could publicly control, the need for quiet power grew even greater. Tony's moment was coming. Not through challenge, not through violence, but through what always lasts longer than both: patience. Power in Chicago during the late Prohibition years did not shift gently. It moved through fear, through money, and through betrayal dressed as loyalty. Alliances were temporary. Promises were fragile. Every partnership carried the unspoken understanding that someday, one side might decide the other had outlived its usefulness. Tony understood this better than most. He never assumed protection was permanent. He never believed that loyalty alone would save him. Instead, he built something stronger than allegiance. He built independence within dependency. He was inside the machine, but not trapped by any single gear. While others tied their survival to one powerful figure, Tony tied his to systems, routes, networks, information. He learned how money flowed through different layers of the organization. He learned where decisions truly originated versus where they were announced. And most importantly, he learned how to exist between those layers without exposing himself to either side fully. This gave him quiet leverage. If a dispute erupted between higher-ranking figures, Tony was never seen as a threat, only as a solution. He wasn't trying to replace anyone. He was trying to keep things running. That made him useful to everyone and dangerous to no one, at least on the surface. But beneath that surface, his position was growing steadily stronger. As investigations began tightening across Chicago, fear spread through the underworld in a new way. Not street fear, legal fear. The kind that stripped men of power without firing a single bullet. Grand juries, federal agents, financial audits. A new kind of pressure that didn't respond to intimidation. Many responded poorly. Some panicked and ran. Some reacted with violence. Some tried to buy protection too late. Tony did none of these. He adjusted. He shifted methods quietly. He reduced exposure. He separated operations so one failure could never destroy everything at once. He ensured that no single trail could lead directly to him. Every layer between him and risk was intentional. He wasn't hiding, he was insulating. Those who worked beside him began to realize something important. Tony never asked for more than he needed, and he never took more than he could defend. His caution wasn't weakness. It was refinement, and refinement lasts. The underworld became more reckless, trying to outrun law enforcement. Tony moved in the opposite direction. The calmer he became, the more others leaned on him. When chaos erupted, Tony brought structure. When tempers flared, Tony brought reason. When others chased short-term victories, Tony extended timelines. He began to influence outcomes without ever appearing to command them. Decisions started aligning with his suggestions. Strategies reflected his thinking. Even men who outranked him would quietly ask his opinion before acting, not because they feared him, but because trusting his judgment felt safer than trusting their own impulses. That trust was the doorway to real power. The city continued to burn with ambition. Names rose and fell at violent speed. Newspapers filled with arrests and killings. Yet behind the noise, the deeper structure of organized crime began to reorganize itself around people who could survive attention instead of attracting it. Tony was becoming one of those people. Not a general, not a king, but a permanent fixture behind whoever wore the crown. And permanence, in that world, was the rarest achievement of all. By the time Prohibition neared its end, the criminal landscape of Chicago was already shifting again. New empires were forming. Old ones were collapsing. And Tony Accardo moved quietly from structure to structure, never exposed, never replaced, never removed. He had mastered the art of transition, and transitions shape history. By the early 1930s, the illusion of untouchable kingship in Chicago was beginning to crack. The city had been run like a battlefield for over a decade, but the federal government was no longer content to chase petty crimes. Its focus narrowed onto one goal: dismantling the heads of organized power. The loudest names were the first to feel the pressure. Tony Accardo watched calmly as the spotlight tightened around those who ruled openly. The world was changing in a way violence could no longer fully control. Courts became deadlier than guns. Paper trails became more dangerous than informants. And reputation, once a shield, became a beacon for prosecution. The most dramatic fall belonged to the era's most visible ruler. Al Capone had built his reign on presence, intimidation, and public dominance. To the streets, he looked unstoppable. But to federal investigators, he became the perfect example. When the charges finally came, they didn't arrive in a hail of bullets. They arrived in the form of tax records. The king did not fall in public combat. He fell in silence. Capone's empire fractured under legal pressure. Panic rippled through every layer of the organization. Men who had lived under his protection suddenly found themselves exposed. Some fled. Some were arrested. Some vanished without explanation. Power was no longer centralized. It scattered. For Tony, this moment was not chaos. It was opportunity, but not the kind that demanded immediate action. It demanded patience. While others scrambled to claim territory and titles, Tony did something far more strategic. He positioned himself as continuity, as stability, as someone who could guide operations without claiming ownership. His quiet reputation for precision became more valuable than any claim to leadership. He was no longer simply surviving transitions. He was shaping them. Decision-makers who once acted independently began aligning their choices with his thinking. He didn't issue commands. He influenced directions. When names changed at the top, Tony remained untouched beneath them, always necessary, never disposable. It was here that his greatest weapon became unmistakably clear: adaptability. As structures collapsed and rebuilt, Tony didn't cling to broken systems. He moved fluidly between them, evolving with each shift. He knew when to detach from failing alliances. He knew when to strengthen emerging ones. And most importantly, he knew when to remain still. Stillness kept him invisible. Invisibility kept him alive. By the middle of the decade, the criminal hierarchy no longer resembled the towering empire of the Prohibition years. It became more subtle, less dramatic, more insulated. And at the core of that transformation was the philosophy Tony had practiced from the beginning. Power should never announce itself. It should simply function. Those who thought leadership meant visibility failed. Those who understood invisibility thrived. Tony had now moved beyond being a trusted operator. He had become a quiet architect, not one who built with brick and steel, but with silence, restraint, And perfect timing. Chicago would soon enter a new era of organized crime, an era less driven by spectacle and more driven by structure. And when that era arrived, the men who survived the transition would not be the loudest. They would be the most deliberate. Tony Accardo had already won that future without ever claiming it publicly, and the city had not yet realized how permanent his influence was about to become. Chapter 3. The Rise Without a Crown. The fall of loud power always creates a vacuum, but vacuums are not filled by noise. They are filled by structure. By the mid-1930s, Chicago's underworld no longer resembled the explosive chaos of the Prohibition years. The streets were quieter, the gunfire less constant. But beneath that calm, something more organized was taking shape. A system built not on fear alone, but on coordination, patience, and invisible leadership. This was the world where Tony Accardo began his true ascent. He did not announce his rise. He did not challenge anyone openly. He simply became unavoidable. Wherever money moved safely, Tony's influence touched it. Wherever disputes were settled without violence, his methods shaped it. Wherever leadership shifted without collapse, his strategy guided it. He was no longer just surviving transitions. He was quietly managing them. To the outside world, criminals were still criminals. Faces rose and fell. Names appeared in newspapers. Arrests made headlines. But inside the machinery, a deeper order was forming. And Tony was one of the few men who understood its full shape. That he no longer ran errands, that he coordinated outcomes. Men who once saw him as the calm young figure in the background now referred matters to him directly. Not because he demanded authority, but because his judgment proved reliable when others failed. When tension grew between crews, Tony smoothed the fracture. When expansion was needed, Tony balanced risk with timing. When whispers of law enforcement appeared, Tony adjusted routes before danger arrived. He was no longer reacting to the system, he was anticipating it. This made him dangerous in a way violence never could. That a violent man can be stopped, that a loud man can be targeted, that a patient man reshapes the world quietly. That patience became Tony's signature. While others fought to sit at the head of tables, Tony focused on owning what passed beneath the table: the logistics, the trust, the money, the communication. Lines no one thought they controlled until they disappeared. Leadership began to change its meaning. Those who wore the title depended on those who understood the structure. And Tony understood it better than anyone. He didn't power through fear, he powered through inevitability. Over time, the question within the organization stopped being, who is in charge right now? It became, who keeps this running no matter who is in charge? And the unspoken answer was always the same: Tony. But true power demands detachment. The higher Tony rose, the quieter he became. He was careful with visibility, careful with alliances, careful with favors, because favors created debts, and debts created leverage. He never collected more leverage than he could safely store. He never pulled on strings unless he could see the entire web. This restraint made him difficult to trace and impossible to corner. Even those who suspected his influence could rarely prove it, because Tony rarely placed himself where influence could be measured. He placed it where outcomes appeared. By the end of the decade, Tony Accardo was no longer rising toward the crown, he was rising past it. The men above him changed. The structure around him did not, and that difference marked the moment when Tony ceased to be an operator and became an anchor. As the 1930s moved forward, the shape of organized crime changed again. The era of loud dominance was fading. The new era belonged to men who understood insulation. Protection not through violence, but through layers. Layers of people, layers of distance, layers of deniability. Tony understood this shift instinctively. He had never needed to be the most feared man in a room. Fear burned bright, but it also burned fast. What lasted was dependence. And Tony positioned himself in places where others depended on him without fully realizing it. Money routes began flowing through channels he influenced. Dispute resolution quietly passed through his judgment. When problems arose between groups that could have reignited open conflict, Tony absorbed the pressure and redirected it without spectacle. Sometimes people did not even realize a crisis had been avoided. They only noticed that everything somehow kept moving. This was his true talent, not control through force, control through continuity. As law enforcement grew more sophisticated, Investigations shifted from street violence toward organizational patterns. The men who once thrived on intimidation struggled under this new scrutiny. Their old instincts no longer protected them. Their visibility became evidence. Tony adjusted before pressure ever reached him. He reduced direct exposure. He made sure no single failure could point upward. Each layer beneath him became both a shield and a filter. Information flowed toward him with precision, but rarely flowed back with enough clarity for outsiders to trace its origin. And while others were still defending old territory, Tony was already thinking about tomorrow's structure. The world was settling into a longer game, and Tony had always been built for the long game. What made him especially difficult to read was not secrecy alone, it was his consistency. He did not exhibit sudden changes in behavior. He did not accumulate excess. He did not shift alliances dramatically. From the outside, nothing about him seemed urgent. That lack of urgency became its own camouflage. Men who feared their own downfall often exposed themselves through desperation. Tony never moved in desperation. When rivals plotted against one another, Tony stayed distant. When betrayals unfolded, Tony remained untouched by blame. When power shifted, Tony remained necessary. In time, others began to realize that removing him would not create chaos, that it would create paralysis, because he was not a single point of command. He was the connective tissue between many points of command. But Tony never allowed that realization to solidify fully. He kept roles narrowly defined. He kept responsibilities distributed. He kept his own name wrapped in understatement. Even those who benefited most from his position rarely spoke about him directly. It was safer not to. His influence began to feel less like leadership and more like gravity, unseen, but always shaping movement. And gravity does not need to announce itself. As years passed, younger figures rose with hunger in their eyes and ambition in their pacing. They sought advancement quickly. They sought recognition. They sought to leave their imprint. Tony observed them the way he had once observed older leaders, quietly, patiently, measuring which would endure and which would flame out. Very few endure. Tony never interrupted their rise, he simply outlasted it. And in outlasting them, he inherited their relevance without ever inheriting their risk. By the end of the 1930s, the criminal landscape of Chicago had stabilized into a quieter balance. Fewer public battles, more negotiated outcomes, less spectacle, more control. This was the world Tony had been shaping all along. A world where power no longer needed to be loud to be absolute. And Tony sat at its center without ever needing to claim it. By the time the decade neared its end, the underworld of Chicago no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a system. Less chaotic, more deliberate, less driven by temper, more driven by arrangement. It was no longer about who could seize the most territory the fastest. It was about who could maintain influence without attracting attention. This shift suited Tony perfectly. He moved through this new world the way water moves through stone, quietly shaping it over time. No public declarations, no violent campaigns, no sudden changes in posture, just steady presence, steady decisions, steady outcomes. The men above him changed, the men beneath him rotated, but Tony remained. That permanence began to carry its own weight. The longer he endured, the more people relied on the idea that he would always be there. And reliance, more than fear or admiration, creates real authority. You can replace a leader. You can challenge a rival. But you cannot easily replace what everyone depends on simply to function. Tony had become dependency itself, and yet, remarkably, very few could say exactly how much he controlled. This ambiguity kept him safe. Anyone who tried to define his reach underestimated it. Anyone who tried to trace it found only fragments. Tony was never located at the center of power because the center moved around him. He placed himself where flow existed: money, communication, trust, not where symbols of authority stood. Other men collected titles. Tony collected leverage without needing to publicly hold it. The city grew used to his presence without truly recognizing it. New alliances formed and dissolved, but Tony remained compatible with all of them. That compatibility was not accidental. It was cultivated. He never closed doors he did not absolutely have to. He never humiliated rivals unnecessarily. He never created enemies unless survival demanded it. This restraint made him difficult to oppose. Those who considered challenging him often found that too many connections depended on his cooperation. Removing him would not weaken a single faction, it would destabilize many at once. So plots never reached him directly. Distrust stopped before it turned into action. Tony knew this. But he never allowed confidence to become arrogance. He remained cautious even as his influence deepened. He knew the greatest danger came not from ambition, but from complacency. The moment a man believes his position is guaranteed, the world begins rearranging itself around his weakness. Tony never made that mistake. By the close of the 1930s, Chicago's criminal structure no longer resembled a pyramid. It was an interwoven network, flexible, layered, decentralized. And Tony stood at a point where many of those layers intersected without ever making himself visible to the entire configuration at once. That IT was the safest place to exist, not above it all, not beneath it all, but between everything. This positioning would allow him to survive wars of power without participating in them. It would allow him to guide transitions without being blamed for them. It would allow him to grow older in a profession that rarely allowed old age. Tony had now completed the most dangerous phase of his life, the phase where a man is visible enough to be targeted, but not yet powerful enough to be protected by consequence. He had crossed that threshold without ever announcing his arrival, and beyond that threshold waited a different kind of challenge, not survival through ascent, but survival through permanence, which, in the world Tony had chosen, would prove to be even more difficult. Chapter 4: The Crown Without a Throne. By the early 1940s, Chicago's criminal world had entered a strange kind of maturity. The violent scramble for dominance that defined earlier decades had cooled into something quieter and more efficient. Power no longer needed to be proven in the streets. It needed to be maintained in rooms where voices stayed low and decisions traveled far, without signatures. And at the center of those rooms, more often than anyone realized, stood Tony Accardo. He still did not hold the most visible title. He still did not command through spectacle or intimidation. But his presence had become unavoidable. Leaders came and went. Strategies shifted. Alliances changed. And still, Tony remained the constant thread running beneath every transition. This was the moment when his influence crossed into something permanent. Accardo had learned long ago that crowns attracted storms. Men who wore them openly became targets for rivals, law enforcement, and ambition from within their own ranks. So he declined the spotlight again and again, even as it drifted naturally toward him. Instead of becoming the king, he became the man who decided which kings would remain standing. This kind of control could not be challenged directly. Anyone who opposed a visible leader could organize resistance. But how do you challenge a presence that never announces itself? How do you remove someone when you cannot point to the exact place where their power begins? Tony's authority lived in the margins between decisions. It existed in delayed movements, rerouted payments, smooth negotiations, and warnings delivered quietly just in time. He did not order outcomes. He shaped the conditions that made certain outcomes inevitable. And inevitability is the most powerful force of all. During this period, younger figures emerged with burning urgency. They wanted rank. They wanted territory. They wanted to accelerate the climb that Tony had taken decades to complete. They confused speed with strength and bravado with permanence. Tony observed them carefully. Some he allowed to rise. Some he quietly redirected. Some he simply outlived. Not all threats require confrontation. Sometimes they require patience. As law enforcement pressure continued to evolve, organized crime refined its methods even further. Violence became quieter. Transactions became cleaner. Communication became more insulated. The world Tony had helped build was now operating almost like a shadow corporation. Layered, silent, resilient. And within that corporation, Tony served as something far more enduring than an executive. He was institutional memory. He remembered every transition, every betrayal, every collapse, every unexpected consequence. And because of that memory, he often saw the future more clearly than those rushing toward it. When others debated risk, Tony measured cost. When others pursued ambition, Tony weighed consequence. When others feared losing power, Tony focused on preserving structure. That difference made him indispensable. Those who wore visible authority began to understand that challenging Tony would not result in a single conflict. It would fracture everything beneath their feet. The machine would stall. Routes would be disrupted. Communications would darken. And what replaced that void would be unpredictable. They did not challenge him. They consulted him, and consultation, over time, becomes dependency. Tony never demanded obedience, that he cultivated necessity. By the midpoint of the decade, organized crime in Chicago no longer revolved around a single charismatic figure. It revolved around continuity. And continuity flowed through Tony's hands without him ever announcing ownership. This was the crown without a throne, and Tony wore it without ever needing to sit high enough for anyone to aim. Power, when it grows large enough, becomes heavy, not because of what it can do, but because of what it must constantly prevent. By the middle of the 1940s, Tony Accardo was no longer just influencing outcomes quietly. He was quietly carrying the burden of an entire criminal structure that depended on balance. Every major decision now rippled through dozens of connected operations. A single misstep could wake the chaos he had spent years putting to sleep. This was the price of permanence. Tony no longer lived in the world of quick reactions. He lived in the world of delayed consequences. Every move he made had to account for what it might cause, not tomorrow, but years from now. This forced a different kind of discipline, a slower kind of thinking, and Tony adapted. He began to value prevention over correction. Instead of resolving conflicts after they erupted, he reshaped conditions so they never ignited. He redirected ambition before it hardened into rebellion. He softened rivalries before they crystallized into war. Many of these adjustments happened so quietly that even the men involved never realized they had been redirected. They believed they were following their own instincts, making their own strategic choices. Only later would they understand that the path in front of them had been gently bent long before they reached the junction. This was Tony's true genius. He didn't push people. He repositioned reality. As post-war America entered a period of expansion, money flowed more freely than ever before. Opportunities multiplied, and with opportunity came temptation. More territory, more business, more risk. Some leaders grew impatient. They wanted faster growth, bolder moves, louder proof of dominance. They mistook momentum for safety. Tony did not. He understood that the louder the movement, the brighter the light. And the brighter the light, the shorter the lifespan. So while others leaned into expansion, Tony leaned into insulation. He layered more buffers between the core of operations and the doors where law enforcement knocked. He made sure no single failure could fracture the entire structure. And slowly, something remarkable happened. The organization stopped feeling like an empire. It began to feel like infrastructure. Invisible. Essential. Taken for granted. People did not see it. They simply moved on top of it. This invisibility became the greatest form of protection. Men stopped competing for public recognition because there was no longer a public king to unseat. Power was diffused, distributed, and quietly reinforced through Tony's influence. Removing any single name no longer guaranteed collapse. This frustrated rivals. It confused investigators, and it frustrated those within the underworld who dreamed of dramatic ascents. Because spectacle no longer ruled, system did. Tony never celebrated this transformation. He understood that systems only remain stable as long as they are respected. The moment complacency enters, decay soon follows. He maintained vigilance not through fear, but through awareness. He kept listening long after others stopped paying attention. He watched how moods changed in meetings, how voices lowered when risk grew near, how impatience revealed itself before it became defiance. And always, he adjusted before tension matured. By the late 1940s, Tony had reached a position no one had officially given him. Yet everyone recognized it, that he was no longer merely shaping the structure, he was safeguarding it. And safeguarding power requires a steadiness that ambition alone can never provide. By the end of the decade, something unusual had taken hold of Chicago's underworld. Fear was no longer directed at a single name. Resentment no longer focused on one leader. Ambition no longer pointed clearly at one throne. Instead, everything seemed to orbit an invisible center. And at that center stood Tony Accardo, not as a figure to challenge, but as a force no one could directly touch. Those who once saw power as something to seize now began to see it as something to approach carefully. The closer one moved to Tony's sphere of influence, the more they realized how deeply interwoven his presence had become. Removing him would not remove a leader. It would rupture an entire framework. This realization changed behavior. Men who previously might have plotted against him chose instead to align with him. Rivals who might have tested his limits decided it was safer to exist within them. Opposition did not soften because Tony inspired affection. It softened because he had made resistance impractical. That is the purest form of dominance, not fear, not admiration, but inevitability. Tony did not rule through commands, that he ruled through consequences that were felt long before they were understood. If communication slowed, people felt it. That if money rerouted, people felt it. If protection lessened, people felt it. And they adjusted accordingly. No threats were issued. No warnings were announced. Behavior simply corrected itself in response to invisible pressure. This was the moment when Tony's reputation transformed. He was no longer seen as merely powerful. He was seen as untouchable, not because he was unreachable, but because reaching him would require unraveling the very system that kept everyone else alive. Even law enforcement struggled with this reality. Investigators could sense the presence of a stabilizing figure behind the scenes, yet every trail dissolved before it reached him. Witnesses knew what mattered to survive, and silence had become a shared instinct rather than an enforced rule. Tony's shield was not built from fear alone. It was built from dependency, structure, and self-preservation all working together. And perhaps the most unsettling part of his rise was how little joy he appeared to take in it. Power did not make him louder. It made him quieter. The deeper his influence reached, the more he retreated from visibility. He traveled less. He spoke less. He placed more distance between himself and any single operation. This distance was not retreat. It was insulation perfected. By the time the 1940s drew to a close, Tony Accardo had achieved something most men in his world never touched. He had become permanent. Not permanent in title, not permanent in publicity, but permanent in function. And when a man becomes permanent in function, history no longer measures his power by what he takes. It measures it by what cannot continue without him. Chicago's underworld now moved with a steadiness it had never known before, and that steadiness bore Tony's quiet signature. But permanence carries its own hidden threat, because the longer power lasts, the more invisible enemies begin to gather in its shadow. And Chapter 5 will begin with the moment when that shadow finally begins to shift. Chapter 5, when the world begins to change. By the early 1950s, the city no longer remembered the chaos that once defined it. Chicago still moved with ambition. Money still changed hands in quiet ways. Influence still shaped decisions behind closed doors. But the volume had lowered. The violence that once roared now whispered. The system had learned how to survive without attracting constant attention. And at the heart of that balance stood Tony Accardo. But the world outside his invisible structure was changing, and changing fast. America was entering a new era. Television brought scrutiny into living rooms. Federal agencies grew stronger. Financial systems became more complex. Paper trails grew longer. The old ways of disappearing into shadows no longer worked as easily as they once had. Where once a man could vanish with silence, now records followed him. Tony was already preparing. He understood that survival was no longer about outlasting rivals alone. It was now about outlasting systems, legal, financial, and public. The battlefield had moved from alleyways into courtrooms, from whispered threats into documents and subpoenas. And Tony adjusted before the shift became obvious. He tightened distance even further. He reduced direct contact. He layered his insulation with new structures designed specifically for a world governed by records instead of rumors. He ensured that nothing connected him too closely to any single operation. Where others tried to outrun change, Tony absorbed it. He did not resist modernization, that he weaponized it. While younger figures chased immediate expansion, Tony prioritized invisibility within complexity. The system now had so many moving parts that tracing responsibility became almost impossible. Every piece appeared independent, every failure isolated, every success detached from a single source. This fragmentation protected him more than any weapon ever could. But progress creates tension. The newer generation did not fully understand the slow discipline that had built this structure. They grew up with stability they did not earn and security they did not construct. Some mistook that stability as proof that the system could not be shaken. Tony knew better. Stability is always temporary. It only feels permanent when people grow tired of guarding it. and fatigue had begun to creep in. Meetings grew shorter. Complacency grew quietly. Risk returned in subtle ways. Small shortcuts appeared. Minor assumptions replaced careful verification. Men who had not lived through collapse began to forget what collapse looked like. Tony saw it all that he did not scold it. He redirected it, he adjusted roles. He quietly replaced weak links. He rerouted trust toward those who remembered the cost of mistakes. And with each small correction, the machine continued to function, even as its environment grew more dangerous. The public never noticed. But beneath the city's calm exterior, Tony was waging his longest battle yet, the battle against stagnation. Because stagnation kills systems just as surely as violence kills them. By the middle of the decade, the pressures surrounding organized crime had shifted completely. The threat was no longer only law enforcement. It was exposure, media attention, informants driven by new incentives, a society becoming more willing to document everything. And once the world begins to document you, it becomes harder to erase yourself from it. Tony's challenge was no longer how to rise. It was how to remain unseen while standing at the center of everything. And this time, that challenge would come not from enemies in the street, but from eyes watching quietly from afar. The pressure did not arrive with flashing lights. It arrived quietly, around dinner tables, inside offices, across courthouse hallways and newsroom desks. By the mid-1950s, the machinery of scrutiny had fully awakened. Committees examined corruption. Reporters asked broader questions. Financial records no longer stayed buried as easily. What once took brute force to uncover now took patience and paperwork. And still, at the center of the storm, Tony Accardo remained absent from the surface of every inquiry. This absence was not luck. It was design. Every structure he had built contained distance, layers of separation that turned investigation into a maze. Each line of questioning led to someone else. Each paper trail ended with a name that was not his. The farther authorities dug, the more complex the system appeared. And complexity is the natural enemy of impatience. Investigators grew frustrated. Timelines collapsed under inconsistency. Witnesses contradicted each other. Stories shifted. Memory failed. Fear resurfaced, slow and quiet. And the deeper the search went, the further Tony seemed to recede, like a figure walking away down an endless corridor. But pressure changes people. Some tighten under it, others crack. Tony had spent decades identifying who would do which. He had already mapped not just loyalty, but endurance. Those who endured were elevated. Those who hesitated were distanced. Those who wavered were removed quietly, without spectacle. The public never noticed the reorganization, but the system felt. It felt leaner, sharper, more controlled. Fear had returned, not as panic, but as discipline, and discipline restored balance. Still, even Tony could not stop the world from shrinking. Television brought crime into living rooms. National headlines crossed city borders overnight. A name whispered in one state now echoed across others within hours. Secrecy was no longer just about silence. It was about velocity. Information now moved faster than caution. And for the first time in decades, Tony found himself adapting not to rivals, but to speed. He slowed things intentionally. Money took longer routes. Decisions passed through extra filters. Meetings became rarer. Communication turned indirect. Every process was designed to absorb delay, because delay blurred accuracy. This frustrated those who craved quick expansion. Tony saw speed as danger. Speed creates errors. Errors create fragments. Fragments create patterns. And patterns invite attention. By forcing the system to move slower than the outside world, he made it nearly unreadable to those trying to observe. It was a war of timing. And timing was Tony's greatest weapon. Yet while the system bent to his adjustments, something else began to form beyond his reach. Public awareness. The people no longer feared faceless influence as abstract rumor. They feared it as something real, systemic, and present. That fear did not target Tony directly, but it created a climate where long shadows felt heavier. In such a climate, even a man who thrives on invisibility becomes aware that invisibility itself can attract interest. Tony had built his world to survive silence, but now silence was becoming suspicious. And in the distance, far beyond Chicago, forces were aligning that would eventually challenge even the perfection of his restraint. By the late 1950s, the pressure had become ambient, not loud, not explosive, just always present. It settled into the air like weather. In Chicago, people still went to work, still filled bars at night, still moved through the city with routine confidence. But beneath that routine lived a quiet awareness that unseen forces were shifting. The spotlight had widened. The questions had grown sharper. And even though no single name dominated the headlines, the sense of approach was unmistakable. The center of that approaching focus, still untouched by formal accusation, stood Tony Accardo. He did not react with urgency. Urgency creates noise. Instead, he reacted with subtraction, fewer connections, fewer meetings, fewer visible alliances. The structure did not expand anymore. It refined itself. What remained was not a network that reached outward, but one that folded inward, tighter and quieter with every passing year. And in that inward fold, Tony reshaped his role once again. That he no longer needed to be seen as the centered, he needed to be unlocatable. This shift was subtle, but profound. Decisions now appeared to rise from consensus instead of command. Authority looked distributed rather than concentrated. Each layer of leadership believed it controlled something important. Yet no single layer could ever truly locate the whole. This is how permanence hides. Not through dominance, but through diffusion. The world outside, meanwhile, began to look for villains it could name. Public narratives crave faces. Investigations crave targets. History craves symbols. Tony was determined never to become one. And in this pursuit, he achieved something almost paradoxical. The more others speculated about an unseen force guiding Chicago's underworld, the less directly associated he became with any specific event. When indictments came, they found operators. When trials unfolded, they exposed transactions. When stories broke, they named intermediaries. Tony remained what he had always been at his most powerful stage, a presence inferred, never confirmed. Yet still, something had changed, not in his control, but in the rhythm of the world around him. The pace of scrutiny had not slowed, and while Tony could bend momentum, he could not stop time from advancing. Younger men rose who did not fully understand the architecture they inherited. They moved faster. They spoke louder. They trusted shortcuts. And every shortcut created potential visibility. The one thing Tony had spent his lifetime eliminating, he didn't fight these changes openly. He allowed them to unfold at a controlled distance. Sometimes, evolution must be observed before it is corrected, because correction too early reveals your position. And Tony's position remained exactly where it needed to be, untraceable. By the close of the decade, the city felt stable again on the surface. The inquiries dulled, the newspapers turned to new scandals, the people exhaled. But stability built on unresolved pressure never truly settles. It pauses. And in that pause, something begins to gather, not as opposition, but as inevitability. Tony had mastered survival in silence. But silence itself was becoming louder, and with it came the beginning of a reckoning that would not look like the others, not violent, not sudden, but slow, measured, and unavoidable. Chapter 6: The Cost of Staying Invisible. By the early 1960s, Chicago no longer felt like the battlefield it once had been. The streets were calmer, the headlines quieter, the violence carefully rationed. On the surface, it looked like peace. But beneath that calm, power was still moving silently through rooms without walls and corridors without sound. And somewhere inside that invisible structure, still untouched by handcuffs or headlines, remained Tony Accardo. Yet even invisibility has a cost. The farther Tony pulled away from daily operations, the more he relied on others to carry the weight he once held himself. Delegation created insulation, but insulation also created distance. And distance created questions, not from law enforcement, from inside. Younger figures had begun to rise with confidence, shaped by an era without chaos. They had not lived through the bloodshed that forged restraint into instinct. They moved with ambition rather than memory. They saw structure as opportunity rather than survival. To them, Tony was not a threat, he was a symbol. And symbols invite reinterpretation. Tony sensed this early. He did not react with force. Force reveals insecurity. Instead, he began testing the system, not to break it, but to measure its loyalty. He waited, and he watched. Small decisions were delayed intentionally. Certain approvals were withheld. just to see what would happen in the absence of quiet authority. Patterns emerged immediately. Some men waited. Others acted without permission. The same instinct that once built empires now hinted at fractures. Tony didn't confront them, that he noted them. Power does not rush correction, that it observes potential outcomes first. And in those outcomes, Tony saw the shape of a new era forming. One that would not be defined by fear alone, but by negotiation between visibility and control. Meanwhile, the world outside continued accelerating. Crime was no longer whispered through neighborhoods alone. It was tracked statistically, studied academically, broadcast nationally. And organized crime was no longer perceived as a local disease, that it was now viewed as a national system. That shift would prove dangerous, because national systems demand national responses. Federal agencies expanded authority. Coordination between cities tightened. Financial surveillance became more sophisticated. The paper world grew thicker, and shadows became harder to hide inside it. Tony's invisibility had always depended on two things: silence and slowness. But speed was taking over, and silence was becoming data. Informants didn't always come from fear anymore. They came from opportunity. Deals replaced threats. Testimony replaced loyalty. Tony had built his empire on relationships that assumed shared risk. But shared risk dissolves when one side is offered safety without consequence. And somewhere beneath the quiet surface of Chicago's calm, that new philosophy was beginning to spread. For the first time in decades, Tony was facing a future he could not completely engineer, a future where the system itself might begin to outpace its architect. Yet still, he did not retreat. Nor did he advance, that he adjusted, gradually, methodically, like a man shifting weight across ice that has begun to crack. Inside every long-standing structure, there comes a moment when loyalty quietly changes shape, not because of betrayal, but because of time. By the mid-1960s, many of the men who once built Chicago's hidden framework alongside Tony Accardo were aging. Their hands were slower, their instincts dulled by comfort, their memories filled with risks they no longer had the strength to face again. And beneath them, a younger generation waited. These men did not grow up hiding. They grew up benefiting. They inherited stability without ever paying its original price. To them, the city's calm felt natural, permanent, almost guaranteed. And when calm feels guaranteed, restraint begins to disappear. Tony watched this shift carefully. He noticed how conversations changed: less caution, more boldness, more assumptions. That he noticed how decisions once delayed were now rushed, how silence once respected was now questioned, how patience, the very trait that had kept the system alive, was beginning to feel outdated. The men below him were not disloyal. They were simply unfamiliar with collapse. And unfamiliarity with collapse breeds risk. Tony responded the only way he ever had, without confrontation. That he redirected influence instead of removing it. He allowed space for ambition to express itself quietly while tightening structural pressure in ways that were almost invisible. Money flows were adjusted. Partnerships subtly rerouted. Protection shifted in small increments, not enough to spark panic, just enough to restore discipline. Yet even discipline cannot fully compete with generational momentum. Where older leaders feared exposure, younger ones believed exposure could be managed. Where once secrecy was absolute, now negotiation with authority felt possible. Deals were whispered, cooperation tested in shadows. For the first time in decades, the concept of too big to touch began to soften. Tony felt this change more than he saw it, because power doesn't announce when its foundation begins to erode. It whispers, and the most dangerous whispers come from inside. Meanwhile, beyond Chicago, something even larger was taking shape. A national effort, not aimed at one man, not aimed at one city, but aimed at systems. Federal attention no longer narrowed its focus to individual figures. It widened the lens to follow movement across borders, across accounts, across communications. The age of isolation was ending. The age of connection had begun. And connection is lethal to structures built on separation. Tony had spent his life perfecting separation. Now the world was perfecting connection. And for the first time, those two philosophies were on a collision course. Still, he did not panic that he had faced worse. But the shape of this threat was different. This enemy did not operate with guns. It operated with numbers, paper, patterns. And once patterns become visible, Even the quietest man begins to cast a shadow. Tony understood something most never do. You can defeat rivals. You can intimidate enemies. But you cannot intimidate history once it begins to record you. By the late 1960s, the system still functioned, still moved, still produced silence. But beneath that silence, the tone had changed. It was no longer the calm of control. It was the calm of waiting. Waiting for something unseen to finally surface. By the end of the 1960s, the world no longer moved at Tony Accardo's original pace. Cities changed faster than institutions. Technology moved faster than trust. And information traveled faster than influence. Still, Tony Accardo remained where he had always been, just outside the reach of consequence, just beyond the edge of proof. But even the most carefully constructed invisibility cannot fully escape the pull of time. The danger now was no longer sudden violence. It was gradual exposure. Tony had built a system designed to survive force. What he now faced was erosion, subtle, slow, and relentless. Small leaks appeared where walls once stood firm. Paperwork connected where silence once ruled. Old memories resurfaced in new contexts. And the past, which had once faded safely into rumor, began to harden into record. He responded not with retreat, but with refinement. His world grew smaller. Fewer voices were allowed near him. Fewer names were spoken in his presence. Fewer decisions were discussed openly. That he no longer needed to move the machine. He only needed to keep it from moving toward him. And yet, with every year that passed, the cost of isolation grew heavier. Distance protected him, but it also separated him from the very instincts that had once made him untouchable. He now depended on secondhand awareness, on filtered reports, on the judgment of others whose likeness to his own discipline faded with every generation. Power, once felt directly through consequence, was now measured through delay. And delay is never permanent. The city's undercurrent still bore his design. Money still flowed along channels he had carved. Authority still pooled where he had directed it. But the current itself was changing speed, faster, louder, less patient. Restraint was no longer the natural language of power. Visibility was. And visibility is the one thing Tony had spent his entire life avoiding. By this time, many assumed Tony had already stepped away from the center. To outsiders, it looked as though newer figures now guided the city's unseen engine. That assumption was not entirely false, nor was it correct. Tony had not retreated. He had repositioned. That he allowed others to absorb the glare while he remained in shadow. He let names rise and fall without attaching his own. He permitted the illusion of change to protect the continuity of his influence. This, too, was a survival strategy. But illusions fracture when pressure increases, and pressure was still building. Not loudly, not violently, but persistently. Tony understood that the next challenge would not arrive with an announcement. There would be no clear beginning, no single attack, no obvious enemy. It would come disguised as procedure, protocol, process. And by the time it became visible, it would already be too integrated to stop. For the first time in his life, survival would not depend on instinct alone. It would depend on endurance against a world built to remember. And a world that remembers is the most dangerous environment any hidden man can face. This was the season when Tony's silence became heavier than ever, not because of fear, but because even he could feel that. Time itself had begun to lean in. Chapter 7. The Illusion of Distance. By the early 1970s, the world believed it had moved on. New headlines dominated the air. New scandals captured attention. New conflicts reshaped public fear. Chicago, once the loud heartbeat of organized power, now felt like an old story, something studied instead of lived. And yet, beneath the surface, the system still breathed, quietly, steadily. And at the deepest layer of that breathing structure remained Tony Accardo. Older now, slower in movement, but still positioned where consequence could not comfortably reach. The outside world. It appeared that Tony had dissolved into background life. He was no longer spoken of openly. His name faded from gossip, from rumor, from memory itself. It looked like retirement. It wasn't. It was distance perfected. Tony had learned that power does not vanish when it becomes quiet. It only becomes harder to locate. And location, in a world built on visibility, is everything. While others accumulated attention through risk, Tony accumulated time. He let younger figures climb toward light while he slipped deeper into shadow. He allowed the machinery to spin with fresh faces while his presence remained implied rather than seen. And in doing so, he created something almost impossible to challenge, a system where no single removal could cause collapse. This was the ultimate evolution of his architecture, not leadership that sat at the top, but influence woven so deeply into the fabric that pulling any one thread would unravel everything. Why now? His role was no longer to command. It was to stabilize. He no longer pushed the current, he shaped the river, and rivers obey terrain more than force. Yet even rivers can be redirected. Federal pressure had not disappeared. It had matured. Where once law enforcement chased spectacle, they now chased continuity. Patterns that lasted, structures that endured, money that moved even when names changed. They no longer hunted men. They hunted systems. And systems cannot flee. They can only adapt. Tony understood this more clearly than anyone alive. That is why he chose stillness over motion. Stillness confuses radar. Stillness avoids edges. Stillness feels like absence. But absence is not emptiness. It is concealment. From his position of deliberate isolation, Tony watched the world study a version of his legacy that no longer included his face. Men went on trial. Alliances collapsed. Neighborhood power shifted hands again and again. But the deeper structure, the one that fed these waves, remained anchored. Anchors do not move often. But when they do, the sea changes direction. Tony had not moved his anchor in decades. Yet now, for the first time, he felt the tension of tides pulling in unfamiliar ways. The illusion of permanent distance requires constant upkeep. And even the most disciplined architect must occasionally step close enough to ensure the walls still stand. This chapter marks the moment when Tony begins to lean slightly back toward the world, not in fear, but in assessment. Distance can protect a man, but distance can also invite curiosity. By the middle of the 1970s, the illusion that Tony Accardo had faded from relevance had settled into public belief. New names filled courtrooms. New faces appeared in surveillance reports. New ambitions rose where old restraint once lived, and that belief, that Tony was finished, quietly became his greatest disguise. Even federal attention shifted toward younger figures. Investigators chased the loud ones, the fast ones, the men who liked attention. Tony's absence from spectacle removed him from urgency. And urgency, more than evidence, drives pursuit. But inside the system, something else was happening. Without Tony's direct presence, misunderstandings grew. Decisions that once passed through a single, disciplined filter now passed through multiple temperaments. Caution fragmented, confidence multiplied, and momentum began to outrun wisdom. Tony observed this with controlled concern. He did not intervene rashly. Rashness exposes location. Instead, he made small adjustments, the kind only a man at the deepest layer of power could make without being seen. Partnerships cooled without explanation. Resources shifted direction without announcement. Influence rebalanced as if by natural drift. Those closest never noticed whose hand was guiding the change. They only felt outcomes, and outcomes corrected behavior. Yet even this mastery could not fully soften the approaching truth. Time was changing the culture faster than any individual could slow it. The men rising now were not shaped by survival. They were shaped by opportunity. Where Tony's generation learned silence through bloodshed, the new generation learned confidence through inherited stability. They believed systems existed to be used, not preserved. They tested limits because they had never lived beyond them. This testing created noise. Noise attracted pattern. Pattern drew attention, and attention eventually circles back toward origin. Even in Tony's deliberate stillness, that circle had begun to close, not tightly, not urgently, but inevitably. Inside his shrinking personal world, Tony adjusted his living quietly. He traveled less, spoke with fewer people, trusted narrower channels, not out of fear, but out of precision. His movements became almost ceremonial in their minimalism. Each outing measured, each contact filtered, each message indirect. Every unnecessary exposure removed like excess weight from a vessel meant to remain submerged. Yet isolation has a cost beyond safety. It dulls immediacy. Tony now learned of events moments too late for instinctive correction. He began to depend on interpretation rather than perception. And interpretation always carries distortion. The danger was no longer that someone might betray him. The danger was that someone might misunderstand him. And in a system designed around quiet alignment, misunderstanding can be more destructive than disloyalty. Still, Tony refused to surface, because surfacing would mean becoming visible again, and visibility, at this stage, no longer produced fear. It produced curiosity. Curiosity draws scrutiny. Scrutiny invites structure, and structure is the one force even Tony could not bend without cost. The river still obeyed his terrain, but new currents were beginning to carve around it. By the end of the 1970s, the illusion of distance had become complete. The outside world. Tony Accardo was no longer the central force people whispered about. His name surfaced only in histories, in trial transcripts from years past, in books that tried to explain an era that already felt distant. New legends replaced old ones. New threats filled the space where his shadow once stretched, and that was precisely where Tony wanted to exist. In memory, not in urgency, not in pursuit. His survival had outlasted noise, rivals, law enforcement cycles, generational shifts, and even the cultural transformation of what power looked like. He had become something rarer than feared. He had become forgotten by those who needed to forget him most. But survival at that level is never passive. It requires maintenance, not through action, but through restraint. Tony now lived in a narrowed world of controlled inputs. Every visitor was screened indirectly. Every message filtered through quiet paths. Every development relayed with caution. He no longer gathered information broadly. He curated what reached him. This protected him, and it isolated him. The machine he had built continued to run without needing to announce where it had originated. That was the final proof of his design. Influence no longer required presence. Authority no longer needed assertion. The system itself had become self-sustaining. But self-sustaining systems eventually drift. They adapt without consulting those who built them. And Tony, even in his quiet control, could feel drift taking shape far below his reach. The younger generation reshaped the language of power. They negotiated where others once imposed. They leveraged visibility instead of avoiding it. They moved faster, risked louder, and trusted structure less than momentum. Tony did not oppose this evolution, that he simply refused to participate in it. Participation would require visibility. Visibility would invite relevance, and relevance, at his stage, was dangered. He remained still, not frozen by fear, but anchored by choice. His world had narrowed to essentials: survival, distance, silence, and one final discipline: never allowing nostalgia to pull him back into motion, because motion would remind others where he still existed. The city above continued changing without noticing the foundation beneath it. New buildings rose. Old neighborhoods transformed. The past grew layered beneath progress like sediment. And within that sediment lived the quiet imprint of a man who never needed to stand at the surface to reshape what flowed above him. But even sediment erodes. Even anchors eventually feel the pull of shifting weight. And Tony's stillness, while powerful, could no longer fully prevent the slow arrival of an ending shaped not by violence, but by time. This chapter closes on the moment when survival itself becomes heavier than struggle, when staying invisible requires more effort than ruling ever did. And in the silence where Tony now lived, the sound of history drawing nearer had begun to resonate once again. Chapter 8. The Long Echo of Influence. By the early 1980s, Chicago no longer looked or sounded like the city Tony had once shaped. Steel and concrete replaced brick and shadow. Television replaced whispers. Corporate glass replaced backroom smoke. Yet beneath everything new, the old currents still moved. And far from the spotlight, in a space where relevance no longer demanded appearance, remained Tony Accardo. The world assumed he was finished, not defeated. Just finished. That assumption protected him more effectively than any threat ever had. Law enforcement files shifted toward newer faces. Journalists chased fresher scandals. Younger figures fought louder battles. The past was labeled as history, something archived, studied, and safely distant. But history does not stop shaping the present simply because people stop watching it. Tony's influence no longer moved in waves. It moved in undercurrents. It showed itself in how decisions were framed before they were announced. in which disputes were never escalated, in which conflicts quietly dissolved without explanation. The hand was no longer visible, but the outcomes bore a familiar precision. Stillness had become strategy, and strategy had become legacied in private. Tony's life had narrowed into routine. The days were slower now, the nights quieter. The world he once navigated with constant calculation now required only maintenance. His mind had not softened, but the pace of external reaction had slowed beyond urgency. He watched events rather than shaping them. And in watching, he learned something unsettling. The system no longer needed him in the way it once had. This was not betrayal. It was maturity. Every structure, if engineered well enough, eventually reaches a point where it no longer requires constant guidance. It becomes self-correcting, adaptive, automatic. Tony had built that exact kind of system, and now he was witnessing it operate beyond him. That realization carried no pride. It carried weight, because to build something that can outlast you is power, but to witness it drifting from your control is a different kind of lesson. Chicago's hidden structure was evolving, not rapidly, not violently, but subtly, through adjustment rather than rupture. New rules layered over old principles. Negotiation replaced enforcement. Public exposure replaced secrecy. The language of power itself was changing shape. Tony did not resist this evolution. Resistance would require engagement. Engagement would require visibility. Visibility would invite relevance. And relevance, to a man who had perfected survival, now represented risk. So he remained exactly where he was, outside the cycle. Yet even from that distance, he could sense the approach of something larger. Not an attack, not a conspiracy, but a collective shift in how the world related to authority. The age of myth was ending. The age of record had arrived, and records never forget. Silence has a strange way of echoing through time. For years, the name Tony Accardo had lived quietly behind sealed pages and fading memories. It existed in old court files, in whispered recollections, in half-remembered stories told by men who no longer held power themselves. To the younger world, he was a relic, a figure from another age. But history has a way of resurfacing when the present begins to ask questions it cannot answer. In the 1980s, a new curiosity began to grow. Writers, historians, and investigators turned backward, not to relive the violence, but to understand the architecture that had allowed it to last so long. They searched not for the loudest criminals, but for the silent engineers, and slowly, almost reluctantly, Tony's name returned. Not with urgency. With intrigue, he was no longer described as a direct threat. He was described as a phenomenon. The man who had never ruled loudly. The man whose survival outpaced rivals, time, and pressure. The man who outlasted eras without ever declaring victory. This renewed focus did not bring danger in the traditional sense that it brought attention, and attention, even when distant, shifts the balance of invisibility. Tony did not respond with movement, he responded with absence. Where attention increases, presence must decrease. His world became quieter still. Contacts tightened further. Exposure narrowed into near stillness. He removed himself not only from operations, but from conversations about operations. Even indirect association carried risk now. This was not fear. This was mathematics. The equation of survival had changed again, and Tony adjusted without emotion. Yet the return of his name had another effect he could not fully control. It revived the legend, and legends never remain neutral. Some. He became proof that power could be exercised without spectacle. To others, he became a symbol of everything the system had failed to dismantle. His existence sparked debate without action, reference without reach. This duality strengthened him and weakened him at the same time. Strengthened because he still could not be touched. Weakened because the myth now lived independently of his control. He had once shaped how his influence traveled. Now his influence traveled without him. The outside world no longer needed Tony to define what Tony had been. It defined him on its own, and that independence was new. Inside his shrinking circle, Tony felt this change not as fear, but as displacement. The machine he built no longer reflected his will directly. It reflected an interpretation of his legacy. Interpretation simplifies, simplification distorts, and distortion, over time, becomes truth to those who never saw the original. Tony had become a version of himself shaped by memory rather than motion. And while memory cannot arrest a man, it can outlive him. The world did not chase Tony anymore. It studied him. And being studied is the final phase before something becomes permanent. But permanence, for a man who survived through movement and adjustment, is not safety. It is confinement. By the late 1980s, Tony Accardo no longer existed as a moving force in the public imagination. He existed as a chapter, a figure whose actions were now placed inside timelines instead of courtrooms. A presence discussed in past tense rather than in warning. The world speaks differently about what it believes is finished, and yet, for the man himself, nothing felt finished at all. Tony still lived within the discipline that had preserved him for a lifetime. Each day followed unspoken rules. Each decision passed through filters built from decades of survival. Even as the world categorized him as an artifact of history, he continued to operate under the same quiet logic that had always guided him. Do not invite proximity. Do not invite curiosity. Do not invite symmetry between past and present. Where others aged into nostalgia, Tony aged into reduction. The space around him continued to shrink, not as loss, but as design. Fewer conversations, fewer connections, fewer moments that carried consequence. Life narrowed into control rather than experience. This narrowing was not sadness. It was containment, because nothing exposes a man faster than expansion. The system he had once shaped continued to breathe on its own. It no longer required direction from the hands that built it. New leaders made new choices under rules that looked similar but were no longer the same. Tony could feel the distance now. Not emotional distance, structural distance. The world had moved beyond needing him, and yet, the memory of him still influenced how power behaved. People referenced restraint without remembering where it had been learned. They honored caution without recalling its origin. They obeyed patterns without recognizing the architect. That is the last form of influence. When your presence is no longer required for your design to continue. But this kind of permanence carries a quiet ache, because permanence means replacement has already occurred. Tony had not been overthrown, that he had been absorbed into the systems he created, into the rules he wrote through behavior rather than words, into the culture that learned his lessons without knowing his name. The public world now treated him as a solved story, something that belonged to the past and could be analyzed at leisure. That misunderstanding was its own shield. It discouraged pursuit, suspicion, urgency. A man described as history is rarely hunted as threat, and so, Tony remained where he had always survived best. Outside emotion, outside noise, outside reach, but now, also, outside relevancy. The most dangerous moment for any long-standing force is the moment the world stops expecting it to act, because that is when recklessness grows elsewhere. And Tony could sense that recklessness returning in places where silence once held. This chapter closes with a paradox. Tony had survived long enough to outlive his own era, but the era that replaced it no longer obeyed the same rules. And when the rules change for everyone, even the men who wrote the old ones must eventually reckon with the consequences. Chapter 9. The Slow Unraveling of Myths. By the early 1990s, the world no longer waited for the past to return. It archived it. Chicago had transformed once more, not just in skyline, but in spirit. Corporate power replaced street power. Digital records replaced whispered agreements. Influence now traveled through contracts instead of corridors. And yet, beneath this polished surface, the long echo of old systems still pulsed faintly. Somewhere beyond headlines and public memory lived Tony Accardo, not as a ruler, not as a legend in motion, but as a living remnant of a world that once operated by completely different laws. He was already gone, not physically, conceptually. The younger generation spoke of organized crime as something historical, a chapter closed by prosecutions, reforms, and time. They studied it the way people study ancient empires, searching for structure rather than threat, and that misunderstanding reshaped everything. Because what people label as finished, they stop watching. Tony could feel this shift even in isolation. Attention had drained away, not violently, not suddenly, but naturally, the kind of fading that happens when relevance is replaced by curiosity. And curiosity eventually fades as well. For decades, Tony had survived because the world feared what it could not fully see. Now the world believed it had already seen everything. This belief did not alarm him. It concerned him, because overconfidence is the most dangerous blindness of all. Inside the structures he once shaped, leadership no longer followed discipline. It followed opportunity. Negotiation replaced caution. Exposure replaced secrecy. Image replaced silence. Tony had built power through what was never said. Now power was built on what could be publicly justified. That transition erased many of the unspoken rules he had relied on. The system was no longer hiding. It was rebranding. Yet, even in this transformation, Tony remained untouched. Not because he was unreachable, but because the system itself had moved past the idea of targeting him. That he was now perceived as inactive, irrelevant, finished. That perception became his quiet protection. But protection without control carries unfamiliar risk. Tony no longer shaped outcomes. He only observed them. And what he observed unsettled even him. The newer power players had no patience for silence. They spent freely, spoke freely, and trusted the systems that documented everything. They believed paper protected them the way fear once had. Tony knew better. Paper never forgets. Fear eventually fades. And forgetting is the most dangerous luxury any system can afford. The myth of his influence began to drift, not shrinking, but mutating. Some embellished it beyond truth. Others minimized it into something harmless. And in this distortion, Tony could no longer recognize the mirror of who he had been. A man becomes dangerous when he is underestimated, but a man becomes invisible when he is misremembered. And Tony Accardo was now entering the phase no architect ever truly controls. The phase where the world decides for itself what he once meant. Time does not erase power. It alters the way power is understood. By the mid-1990s, Tony Accardo had become something unusual, a man still alive, yet spoken of as though he belonged entirely to another century. Books mentioned him. Old case files preserved his name. Documentaries revisited his era. But in the forward motion of the present, he no longer appeared in calculations. And that was both dangerous and freeing. For most of his life, Tony had existed inside tension. Tension between movement and stillness, between secrecy and command, between survival and dominance. Now, for the first time, that tension weakened. The world no longer pulled at him directly. He existed in a kind of historical neutral zone. The structures he once guided were now guided by others. New networks formed under different rules. Public exposure no longer carried the same stigma. Even prosecutions had become more symbolic than structural. People were arrested, names were printed, but the systems themselves rarely collapsed. This created a strange illusion of control, the illusion that power had been domesticated. Tony had seen illusions before. He knew how comforting they could feel. Inside his quiet isolation, he felt the world loosen, not into safety, but into carelessness. The careful patience that once defined underground power faded. Deals hurried now. Promises bent faster. Memories shortened. And when memory shortens, repetition begins. Tony observed subtle echoes of old mistakes returning in new forms. Greed without discipline. Visibility without protection. Confidence without architecture. The system was not collapsing. It was drifting. Drift feels peaceful until it hits something. Meanwhile, Tony's own presence grew increasingly faint, not in physical reality, but in consequence. Fewer decisions felt traceable to his design. Fewer outcomes reflected his caution. His methods lived on as echoes rather than instructions. That he had not been erased. He had been diluted. Dilution is the smoothest way to remove a force from relevance. Tony no longer corrected behavior through influence. That he corrected it through absence. Those who once waited for signals learned to move without them. Those who once feared consequence learned to gamble without seeing its source. And that shift created a quiet vulnerability that Tony could not fully counter from the distance he had chosen. The world now believed it had outgrown men like him. That belief was premature. Every system that believes it has outgrown its foundations forgets why those foundations were laid in the first place. Tony's methods were born from collapse, not comfort, and comfort was now everywhere. Private life for him had narrowed into repetition. Days followed identical rhythms. Silence became the dominant feature of his surroundings. Conversation was rare. News arrives filtered through disinterest. The burden of anticipation had finally left him. And yet, Peace achieved through irrelevance is not peace at all. It is postponement. Because history never finishes with its architects, it circles back to question them when the patterns repeat, and the patterns were quietly beginning again. By the late 1990s, the world no longer searched for Tony Accardo. It referenced him. And there is a difference. Searching implies threat. Referencing implies conclusion. His name had become a boundary marker in history, a point scholars used to separate one era from another. Before Accardo, they would say. After Accardo. And in doing so, they unknowingly sealed his transformation from living strategist into historical constant. This distinction mattered, because men who remain threats are pursued, but men who become boundaries are studied and then set aside. Tony existed now in that narrow space between myth and record, where danger softens into meaning. His living silence was mistaken for absence, his withdrawal for disappearance, his patience for surrender. But Tony had never surrendered to time. He had only stepped outside its immediate reach. From within his narrowed world, he sensed a subtle shift unfolding beyond him, something he could not intervene in and no longer needed to control. The structures he built were now guided by people who believed the world itself had changed enough to protect them from the consequences of old mistakes. They believed exposure was manageable. They believed systems were negotiable. They believed reputation could be traded without cost. These beliefs did not frighten Tony. They saddened him, because he had seen these exact assumptions collapse entire networks before. Yet this time, the cycle would not point back to him. It would point forward, toward names not yet written. That was the final evolution of his role. From participant to architect to observer to reference, the city no longer moved at his pace, but it still moved along tracks laid by his generation. Even as new power reshaped the skyline, the skeleton beneath remained influenced by his discipline, by caution learned through blood, by restraint learned through loss. Tony had outlived his enemies. He had outlived his rivals. He had even outlived the model of power that once made him untouchable. What remained was something rarer than fear: endurance without relevance, and relevance without exposure. That balance is difficult to achieve, harder still to maintain, but Tony had made a lifetime out of maintaining what seemed impossible. As the century closed, his life no longer resembled the rise of a king or the fall of a criminal. It resembled the slow settling of an earthquake after the damage was already done. The world rebuilt above him without ever fully accounting for what had shifted beneath it. And Tony remained where he had survived best, not removed, not revealed, but concluded. This was no longer the story of a man dodging fate. It was the story of a man who lived long enough to become the line fate used to measure others. Chapter 10: The World Without the Architect. By the early 2000s, the world had learned how to speak in faster rhythms. Information traveled instantly. Records lived online. Memory became searchable. And in that accelerating world, the quiet survival of Tony Accardo felt almost unreal. To most people, he existed only as data now, a name in archived reports, a figure referenced in long-form journalism, a chapter in the story of Chicago's underworld that no longer felt connected to modern life. The city that once moved under his hidden gravity now moved at the pace of screens and servers. Yet systems never forget their foundations. They only bury them beneath new layers. The power structures that defined this new century appeared clean on the surface: corporate, regulated, public-facing. But the behavioral instincts beneath those structures still carried echoes of older lessons: caution without explanation, negotiation without visibility, consequence without direct threat. These instincts did not arrive by accident. They were inherited. Tony had built not just a machine, but a culture of restraint that outlived him as an active force. And even as the world modernized around that inheritance, its core logic remained intact. Still, the distance between legacy and presence widened sharply. Tony no longer influenced outcomes. He influenced boundaries. He no longer altered decisions. He shaped what kinds of decisions seemed acceptable. This is the final tier of influence, when action is no longer required for effect to continue. Yet, even this tier has a limit, because the new century had begun to ask questions differently. Not who controls this, but how does this exist at all? The focus had shifted from people to processes, from figures to frameworks, from individuals to systems. and systems can be audited, traced, mapped. That Tony's lifetime of invisibility had thrived in a world that struggled to map silence. But the modern world mapped everything: financial patterns, communication networks, behavioral cycles. The net was no longer thrown only at suspects. That IT was thrown at motion itself, and motion always leads somewhere. Not necessarily back to its architect, but close enough to test the endurance of any legacy built on concealment. Tony was keenly aware of this shift. Even in isolation, he could sense that the age of intuitive survival had been replaced by the age of analytical exposure. The predator was no longer the rival. IT was the algorithm. Data does not forget, data does not fear, data does not hesitate, and data does not respect silence. For the first time, Tony's survival was no longer defined by human behavior. IT was being measured against systems designed to eliminate the very concept of hiding. This did not frighten him, but it humbled him. Because no amount of discipline can outmaneuver a world that no longer depends on discretion. The question was no longer whether Tony would ever be reached. The question was whether reaching him still mattered. By the middle of the new century's first decade, the city barely remembered the man behind the architecture. Chicago referenced eras now, not names, periods defined by prosecutions, cycles measured by reforms, generations shaped by technology rather than territory, and somewhere far from all of it, still alive yet entirely removed from consequence, existed Tony Accardo, no longer feared, no longer hunted, no longer needed. This was the strangest transformation of all. For most of his life, danger had given his existence definition. Every breath moved against gravity. Every decision balanced against exposure. Even distance had once been an act of resistance. Now distance was simply default. The system operated without asking him permission. The past informed behavior without consulting its author. The city evolved without ever glancing backward. And Tony, the man who had once stabilized storms, now lived in a state where nothing required him any longer. This is not how stories of power usually end. They end with violence, with collapse, with spectacle. Tony's did not. It thinned, gradually, silently, until one day his presence mattered only in explanation, not in decision. And that shift carried a quiet kind of disorientation. Because power does not leave cleanly when it departs through irrelevance. It lingers without purpose. Tony's inner world grew smaller than ever. Conversations narrowed. Observation replaced participation. The timeline of his life no longer intersected with the timeline of the system he had shaped. The machine did not revolt against him. It simply outgrew the need to acknowledge him. That is a colder fate than defeat. And yet, from a survival standpoint, it was perfect. No one reaches for what they believe is already behind them. But legacy is never as still as it appears, because while the system above evolved, the foundation beneath still carried old instincts. Even as modern structures replaced old operations, the reflexes of caution, quiet negotiation, and silent correction still moved invisibly through its behavior. Those reflexes belonged to a generation that had been forced to master patience. Tony's generation. Yet the new players did not know where these instincts came from. They assumed them to be natural. Organizational habits inherited without origin rarely feel borrowed, and that inheritance, unrecognized and uncredited, is the most durable kind. Tony saw this as both proof and warning. Proof that his design had endured. Warning that its endurance was now beyond his control. He had once guided correction. Now correction happened without reference to his will. A legacy that no longer answers back, no longer reflects its creator. It becomes its own entity. And entities without memory eventually drift toward error, drift toward overconfidence, drift toward exposure. Tony could sense that drift in subtle ways, not through reports, not through alerts, but through the tone of the world itself. The tempo had changed. The restraint felt softer. The caution thinner. The inheritance was aging, and aging structures, even when strong, eventually isolate themselves from the instincts that built them. This was the truth Tony now lived inside. Survival without relevance is still survival. But survival without influence is a form of quiet exile. By the late 2000s, the world that once required constant calculation had transformed into one that barely acknowledged the past at all. News moved too fast to linger. Crises stacked upon crises. attention fragmented into seconds, and within that storm of information, the quiet survival of Tony Accardo became something almost unreal. A living man from an era the modern world no longer fully recognized that he was not pursued, he was not questioned, he was not required. His existence no longer competed with history.it drifted beside it. For most men who rise through power, the end comes as a reversal, public, harsh, undeniable. But Tony's ending was shaped by subtraction instead of confrontation. Everything that once defined his presence was gradually removed. Urgency, relevance, immediacy, necessity. What remained was routine, that a life measured not by conflict or command, but by quiet continuity, that he still lived by discipline, still measured his exposure, still reduced unnecessary contact. But these habits no longer protected him from danger. They protected him from returning to danger, and that distinction mattered, because for the first time in his life, survival was no longer a strategy.it was simply a condition. The world outside no longer revolved by rules he helped write. It revolved by systems that processed behavior automatically. Algorithms replaced intuition. Surveillance replaced rumor. Documentation replaced testimony. Tony, who had once mastered silence, now lived in a world that documented even silence. Yet still, no one came. Not because he was untouchable, but because he had become unnecessary. And nothing isolates a builder more completely than watching the structure continue without him. Stories of old power faded into background noise. Young voices did not debate his era. They scrolled past it. History became compressed into summaries. Decades collapsed into paragraphs. And Tony, whose life had unfolded through slow, deliberate consequence, had become a footnote. He was not erased, he was minimized. This was the final transformation of his influence, from dominance to legacy to reference to silence. But silence does not mean emptiness, that it means completion. For the first time, Tony no longer needed to adapt to survive. The world had adapted around him instead. The edges no longer pressed. The tension no longer pulled. What remained was time. And time, unlike rivals or systems, does not negotiate, that it simply continues. This chapter closes on the quiet truth that survival is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is so complete that it becomes invisible even to the one who achieves it. Tony Accardo did not fall, he did not flee, he did not vanish. He simply remained long enough for the world to move on without needing him anymore. Chapter 11. The Man Behind the Silence. By the early 2010s, the world no longer spoke about power the way it once had. It spoke about trends, data, growth, exposure. The language of dominance had shifted from territory to visibility, from silence to attention, from hidden influence to public presence. And in that bright, restless world, the life of Tony Accardo existed almost like a contradiction. He had built everything on what the modern world now ignored: patience, invisibility, indirect control. These traits no longer defined success in the public eye. They defined irrelevance. But behind that irrelevance lived something quieter and deeper than fame ever offers: completion. Tony no longer watched the world with calculation. He observed it with distance. Not bitter distance, not disappointed distance, but detached distance. The kind that comes when a man has already played every move he ever intended to. This was not retirement. This was release. The inner tension that once governed his breathing had settled. The instinct to anticipate danger had softened into memory. The constant readiness for response had relaxed into routine. Yet routine does not mean peace. Routine means repetition without purpose. Tony's days unfolded under strict self-containment. Limited movement, limited contact, limited exposure. The same discipline that once protected an empire now protected a single life. The structure had shrunk inward, from city to network to household to room to silence. And the narrowness of that structure revealed a truth rarely spoken about men who once commanded shadow empires. When the world no longer needs your vigilance turns inward. Tony did not think about rivals anymore. He did not track investigations, that he did not calculate the behavior of others. Instead, he tracked time. Days blended. Weeks folded into seasons. Seasons dissolved into years. And slowly, the only remaining form of power became endurance itself. The legacy moved far beyond him now. New names shaped new decades. New systems defined new conflicts. Chicago no longer reflected the underworld logic he once mastered. It reflected something cleaner on the surface, but equally complex beneath. And yet, faint echoes of his discipline still survived in organizational instincts people could not trace, that a hesitation before escalation, that a reluctance before exposure, that a preference for quiet resolution over spectacle. They did not know why they behaved this way. They only knew it worked. That was Tony's final gift to the world that forgot him. A logic of restraint built into systems that no longer remembered restraints. Origin, yet forgetting cuts both ways. For the men who inherit power without history, arrogance grows faster than caution. And arrogance always invites correction, whether by law, by rivals, or by collapse. Tony sensed this not as threat, but as inevitability. And inevitability, once accepted, removes fear. This chapter does not follow a rise or a fall that it follows what remains after both have already occurred. In the quiet rooms where his days now passed, time no longer felt like an enemy that it felt like a slow companion. Tony no longer woke to threats or whispers. The phone rarely rang. No messengers came. No urgent decisions waited at the edge of sleep. For most of his life, mornings had begun with calculation. Now, they began with stillness. And stillness was unfamiliar. The man who once shaped outcomes without appearing in them now existed outside of outcomes entirely. Events happened without his touch. Decisions unfolded without his permission. The world demonstrated its most humbling truth. Power never vanishes, it only changes hands. From outside, it looked like peace. From inside, it felt like watching a story continue without your name attached to it. Tony followed the news with detached interest. Arrests, trials, new figures rising with loud ambition. Their faces appeared on screens. Their names repeated in headlines. They chased recognition the way earlier generations had chased survival. But recognition had always been the most dangerous currency of all. Those who sought it loudly tended to lose quietly. Tony did not envy them, that he recognized the pattern. The hunger for identity, the need to be known, the urge to prove existence through dominance. He had once felt these impulses himself, long before discipline smothered them beneath layers of restraint. Before survival taught him that visibility shortens opportunity. The irony was impossible to ignore. The world had finally evolved into a place where restraint was no longer admired. And yet, those who survived longest were still those who practiced it unknowingly. Silence remained the most underestimated weapon that in private moments. Memory arrived without warning. Faces he hadn't thought about in years surfaced softly at the edge of thought. Voices returned not as sound, but as feeling. The past did not accuse. It didn't praise. It simply reminded that every decision leaves behind a shadow. Tony did not relive his life with guilt in the dramatic sense people imagine. Guilt requires moral argument. What he felt was weight, accumulated weight, not for individual acts, but for the accumulation itself. For the sheer scale of cause and effect set in motion by still decisions. He had never chased chaos, but chaos had followed him anyway. And now, that chaos no longer moved with his rhythm. It moved independently. The mind adapts. The body slows. What once felt urgent becomes distant. What once felt dangerous becomes historical. That Tony's story had crossed the final threshold. It had become something other. People interpreted. And interpretation strips ownership from experience. The man who once controlled narratives through silence now belonged to memory through rumor. His name floated in conversations detached from fact. Some exaggerated him into myth. Others reduced him into stereotype. Neither version resembled the quiet reality of the man sitting alone with time. This is what remains when legend outlives presence. A form without witness. Yet beneath all of this, beneath loss of authority, beneath erosion of relevance, beneath the quiet shrinking of power, something stayed unchanged. Control of self, the last thing no one could ever take. Toward the end, silence no longer felt emptied, it felt complete. The days no longer needed structure because structure had already finished its work. There was no future left to shape, no influence left to protect. Only breath, light through a window, the passage of hours, and the steady rhythm of time continuing without expectation. For most of his life, time had been something to control. Now, It became something to observe, and observation revealed a truth that power once obscured. The world does not revolve around influence, that IT revolves around replacement. Every system generates its successor. Every authority invites its overturn. Every legend becomes a reference point for those who never lived inside it. Tony had once shaped how entire networks behaved without ever explaining himself. Now, even his silence no longer shaped anything. It simply existed. And that, strangely, was freedom. There was no longer a role to perform, and no longer a mask to maintain, and no longer a consequence to avoid. The identity built through decades of restraint had gently dissolved back into a single human fact, a man nearing the end of time. Death did not arrive like a threat, that IT approached like a closing door that had always been visible, just far enough away not to notice. There were no dramatic final decisions, no confessions, no revelations. Only the gradual narrowing of attention toward smaller things: sound, warmth, light, stillness. The world outside did not pause. It didn't acknowledge the ending of someone who once influenced its hidden structure. Traffic continued. Headlines rotated. New conflicts replaced old ones without recognizing their ancestry. That is how shadow power truly disappears. Not through collapse, but through indifference. When he passed, it did not shift the balance of anything. No alarms sounded, no systems faltered, no reactions echoed through the networks he once commanded. Only memory responded. And memory, unlike power, fades quietly. What remains now is not a man, not influence, not fear. What remains is a lesson written in absence, that the highest form of control is not domination, but the ability to vanish without leaving instability behind. Chapter 12. The World After the Shadow. The first thing that follows the disappearance of power is not chaos. It is adjustment. After the longest reign of quiet influence faded into memory, Chicago did not shake. The streets did not shift. The city did not feel the passing of a man who had once shaped its unseen structure. The trains still ran. The buildings still rose. New businesses replaced old ones. The world demonstrated its most unsettling truth: systems outlive the people who build them. For decades, restraint had been the invisible blueprint beneath Chicago's underworld. Decisions were delayed. Violence was measured. Exposure was avoided. These habits were never written into rules. They were inherited through behavior, and most of the people following them never knew where those instincts came from. What they felt was only consequence. New leadership never arrives with the same patience that IT arrives with hunger. The next generation did not inherit fear. They inherited opportunity. And opportunity without memory always moves louder than tradition. The old codes weakened first in subtle ways. Small risks became acceptable. Public presence grew. Ambition shifted from survival to recognition. The language of the streets changed from whispers to promotion. These shifts didn't happen overnight. They unfolded quietly, so quietly that few realized what was changing until it was already normal. Restraint became hesitation. Silence became irrelevance. Exposure became leverage. In the absence of a stabilizing force, instability doesn't explode, it expands, and expansion invites attention. Law enforcement didn't need to evolve dramatically to adapt. It simply needed time. With more visibility came more evidence. With more ambition came more mistakes. With more noise came more patterns that could be tracked. The tactics of the new world favored data over rumor. Paper trails replaced street whispers. Technology replaced informants. Visibility became vulnerability. And those who had risen without patience discovered that patience had always been the shield they never learned to carry. The paradox of long stability is that it weakens the immune system of power. Because when disruption finally arrives, it arrives all at once. The world without Tony did not collapse, but it did accelerate, and acceleration compresses mistakes. The city did not lose a ruler. It lost a break. At first, the changes felt like progress, more movement, more deals, more visible signs of activity. From the outside, it looked like momentum. From the inside, it felt like liberation. The new figures rising through the structure no longer feared the old invisible boundaries. They tested limits openly. They took credit. They spoke loudly. They wanted to be known, and being known felt like power. But power that seeks attention is power that invites interruption. Where once restraint had slowed everything to a near standstill, speed now became the defining feature. Decisions were made quickly. Alliances shifted overnight. Disputes escalated before anyone considered whether they needed to exist at all. And with each accelerated decision came collateral visibility. Surveillance grew easier. Patterns grew louder. The system that once protected itself by avoiding notice had learned to advertise itself instead. IT was not just law enforcement watching. It was the public. Stories moved faster than they ever had before. Whispers turned into headlines. What once dissolved quietly into dark corners now echoed across screens and courtrooms alike. Stability does not die dramatically. It erodes through impatience. Those who inherited influence did not inherit memory. They did not understand that what they called freedom had once been called vulnerability. They mistook absence of restraint for absence of danger. But danger does not leave. It only waits for contrast. The city adjusted again. It always does. Businesses adapted. New channels replaced old ones. The infrastructure shifted just enough to survive its own exposure. This is how power evolves when fear no longer slows it. Not toward peace, but toward spectacle. And spectacle always carries witnesses. Some of the old figures watched quietly as the changes unfolded. They recognized the cycle. They had lived inside it once themselves. They knew where the speed would eventually lead, but they said nothing because warnings only matter to people who still listen, and the new world no longer listened to silence. When the last echoes of restraint finally faded, what replaced them was not freedom. It was exposure. The city no longer moved in shadows that remembered how to hide. It moved under lights that fed on motion, conflict, and reaction. Every action created an imprint. Every imprint generated attention. And attention reshaped behavior at a speed the old world had never allowed. What once took years to unravel now unfolded in months. Networks thinned, trust shortened, fear returned, not as calculated survival, but as uncertainty. Stability had once been maintained not by force, but by discipline inherited through quiet example. And now that example existed only in fragments, remembered by fewer men each year. Control without visible leadership became imitation without understanding. And imitation breaks easily. The next generation of influence did not collapse the structure. It weakened it through improvisation, through ego, through competition that was no longer guided by preservation. Power became something to display instead of something to protect. And when power becomes a performance, it no longer belongs to its holder. It belongs to its audience. In time, arrests followed. Then convictions. Then silence of a different kind. Not the disciplined silence of strategy, but the empty silence of interrupted ambition. The city adjusted again, as it always does. It absorbed losses, replaced figures, rewrote hierarchy. Nothing stopped. Nothing waited. And in that relentless continuation, the final truth of quiet dominion revealed itself. The greatest influence leaves no visible ending. It simply stops being necessary. What remains is not domination, not command, not control. What remains is shape. The shape of habits that outlived their origin. The shape of restraint inside systems that no longer know why they hesitate. The shape of caution inside ambition that no longer knows where it came from. The shadow does not rule anymore, but its outline still alters how light falls. Chapter 13. The Weight of a Name. Long after the streets stopped responding to his presence, the name Tony Accardo continued to move quietly through rooms he no longer entered, not as a threat, not as a command, but as a reference. In certain conversations, when decisions slowed or hesitation appeared, someone would eventually mention him, not directly, but indirectly. In the old days, they would say, or under the old way. The meaning was always the same. A memory of structure. A reminder of discipline. The power of a name after power itself is gone is a strange thing. It doesn't control actions, but it shapes how people think about consequences. It lingers as an invisible measurement, a standard that no longer has an owner. For decades, his influence had been so subtle that most never noticed it was there at all. Now, as time passed, its absence became noticeable only through deviation, through risk taken too easily, through noise replacing caution, through ambition growing faster than patience. And yet, even in that drift, The memory of the old model never fully vanished. It survived in pauses, in second thoughts, in moments where someone almost acted impulsively and then didn't. That hesitation carried his signature more than any headline ever could. Public history would never record his impact with precision. There was no single document that could trace what he truly shaped. No courtroom presentation ever mapped the full scale of quiet influence. No confession ever summarized the consequences of ordering nothing instead of something. Because most of his authority came not from what he did, but from what he stopped from happening. That is the legacy that historians struggle to measure. Violence leaves records, absence rarely does. New generations studied the old years through fragmented stories, through half-truths, through winners rewriting why they survived. Each retelling bent the past further from reality. Myth grew where documentation was impossible. Simplification replaced complexity. Some exaggerated him into a ghost behind every crime. Others dismissed him as a relic of a slower age. Both were wrong. Reality lived between those extremes, quiet, restrained, difficult to dramatize. True power rarely makes good spectacle. The man himself was now long silent, but the behavioral architecture he left behind continued to shape actions without explanation. People followed rules they never learned, avoided steps they never saw punished, respected boundaries no one could explain. This is how a shadow becomes structure instead of fear, and structure lingers far longer than reputation ever can. With time, every shadow is reshaped by imagination. The living memory of Tony Accardo faded. What replaced it was not clarity, but interpretation. Stories grew cleaner than reality, sharper, easier to repeat. The quiet discipline that had once defined his influence became reduced to simple phrases. He was untouchable. He controlled everything. Nothing moved without his approval. These statements were not false, but they were incomplete. The truth was more subtle than legend allowed. His authority did not come from domination. It came from patience, not from fear created through spectacle, but from stability created through predictability. People trusted the silence because the silence worked, and when memory loses its details, it replaces them with symbols that to newer generations. He became less a man and more a concept, a kind of benchmark for what real power used to look like. But benchmarks flatten complexity. They erase the daily adjustments, the constant self-restraint, the invisible negotiations that made that power function without breaking. The myth of control is always louder than the reality of maintenance. Inside the remaining circles where history still mattered, elders spoke about him carefully. Not with admiration, not with condemnation, but with precision. They remembered the long pauses before decisions, the way answers arrived indirectly instead of through commands, the way problems disappeared without explanation. What people outside those circles never understood was this. His greatest strength was not what he built, it was what he refused to become. He never chased expansion for its own sake. He never confused ambition with stability. He never mistook attention for safety. Those instincts were subtle, and subtlety does not survive when stories travel. The public imagination prefers contrast, good and evil, hero and villain, rise and fall. But his life did not follow that rhythm. It followed a far quieter arc. Expansion balanced maintenance withdrawal. Almost no one notices withdrawal. Withdrawal is interpreted as disappearance. And disappearance invites fiction. Over time, even the man's absence became exaggerated. Some insisted he had continued to control things from the background until the very end. Others claimed he had vanished completely years before his death. Both explanations revealed more about those telling the story than the truth itself. Fantasy expands where documentation ends, and documentation was something he never allowed to exist in the first place. In the end, every legend reaches the same destination: to stillness. It doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply settles, gently, quietly, into the background of history. By the time the last people who truly remembered the full shape of his power began to disappear themselves, the story had already shifted into something softer and less precise. The sharp edges of reality wore down. The discipline became a rumor. The restraint became an idea. What remained was no longer a system. It was an echo, and echoes change with distance. Some repeated the story with awe, some with skepticism, some with nostalgic exaggeration, others with complete disbelief. But none of those versions could reconstruct what daily life inside that world truly felt like. The constant vigilance without visible tension, the decisions that happened without words, the pressure that never needed to announce itself. That is the paradox of quiet power. It feels smaller than it is while it exists, and larger than it ever was once it's gone. Time doesn't preserve precision. It preserves impressions. And impressions blurred. In that blur, people started asking different kinds of questions, not about how everything was controlled, but about why control was even possible in the first place. And the answers were rarely dramatic: routine, habit, restraint. Fear of consequence learned slowly over decades. Those do not convert well into legend. They convert into silence. What remained after everything faded was not the image of a ruler, but the outline of a method, a way of moving through power without exhausting it, a way of surviving influence without becoming consumed by it. That method still exists, scattered, uncredited, practiced by people who never knew its origin. They hesitate without knowing why. They delay without knowing where the instinct came from. They choose invisibility without realizing they are repeating someone else's survival mathematics. This is how influence truly becomes immortal, not through remembrance, but through unconscious repetition. And so, even in absence, structure survives. Chapter 14: The Illusion of the End. By the time the world finally began to speak about the old era in past tense, most people believed the story was already over. They believed the chapters had closed, the players had vanished, the rules had changed, and on the surface, they were right. The streets no longer moved with the same hidden gravity. Deals happened differently now. Power wore new faces. Noise replaced quiet negotiation. Exposure replaced invisibility. The structure that once existed beneath everything had thinned into fragments. But the illusion of an ending is one of the most comforting lies history tells, because systems rarely end. They transform. What disappeared was not influence. It was shape. The old framework had been built for a slower world. A world where time itself acted as protection, where patience created leverage, where silence was a language. The new world did not speak silence anymore. It spoke speed. Information traveled faster than calculation. Reaction outran reflection. The pause that once protected decision-making had collapsed under pressure to move, to respond, to be visible. And in that evolving rhythm, the discipline that once preserved stability struggled to survive. Yet fragments of it remained, not in leadership, not in hierarchy, but in instinct. Certain cautions persisted in unlikely places. Certain figures delayed when momentum pushed forward. Certain conflicts resolved without escalation. Certain ambitions stalled for reasons no one could fully explain. These were not remnants of fear, they were remnants of memory. Memory stored not in stories, but in behavior. Generations removed from the original structure still inherited its reflexes. Not consciously, not deliberately, but through patterns passed forward without names attached to them. This is how the past survives even when people believe it is gone. But survival does not mean dominance. The new power centers did not orbit those instincts anymore. They brushed against them occasionally, sometimes even mocked them. Where once restraint defined competence, now boldness defined relevance. And relevance is far more dangerous than control. The city adapted again. It learned to tolerate volatility. It learned to recover from disruption. It learned to rebuild faster than consequence could fully land. This is the great difference between the eras. The old world prevented catastrophe through avoidance. The new world survives catastrophe through replacement. And survival through replacement creates a different kind of risk. Because when replacement becomes easy, prevention becomes unnecessary. That is when instability becomes permanent. The long shadow that once stabilized disorder through restraint no longer existed to remind power what it should fear. Power began fearing the wrong things. Exposure instead of collapse. Reputation instead of consequence. Scandal instead of destruction. The consequences grew larger precisely because perception shrank. But even in this louder, faster, more reckless environment, the absence of the old system did not create freedom. It created friction, the kind that grinds slowly at everything it touches. Relationships thinned, trust shortened, alliances weakened. Because once restraint disappears, every move must be defended instead of assumed. and constant defense exhausts power faster than any enemy ever could. The illusion of the end had arrived, but the truth was quieter and more unsettling. The ending had not arrived. Only the protection against it had. In the world that followed restraint, conflict no longer waited for permission. It arrived quickly, publicly, and often without warning. Where once disputes unfolded through whispers and intermediaries, now they surfaced through spectacle. The new power no longer feared being seen. In fact, it depended on being seen. Visibility itself had become a form of protection, a shield built from attention. But attention is a weak shield. It draws observers. It invites judgment. And eventually, it attracts pressure. The old world understood something the new world rarely considered. Pressure does not always break from the outside. It accumulates from within. As influence became louder, its internal fractures grew harder to hide. Rivalry sharpened. Loyalty thinned. Alliances became temporary instead of structural. The sense of permanence that once stabilized everything dissolved into transaction. Nothing lasted. Everything negotiated itself again and again. This constant negotiation created motion, and motion created exhaustion. Power without rest is power already collapsing. The city began to feel different, not dangerous in the old way, not predatory in the quiet way, but unstable. Unpredictable. No pattern lasted long enough to become reliable. No deterrence remained strong enough to prevent repetition. People no longer hesitated because hesitation had no anchor. Fear no longer had a consistent face, and fear without a face cannot be managed. The old system had survived not because it was gentle, but because it was repetitive. Repetition teaches behavior. Behavior becomes expectation, and expectation becomes restraint. The new world never allowed expectation to settle. Everything moved too fast. Momentum devoured memory, and without memory, power forgets how to survive. Law enforcement adjusted again. It always does. The modern tools no longer depended on silence breaking. They depended on movement revealing itself. Digital signals replaced human whispers. Surveillance replaced coincidence. The mistakes no longer came from panic. They came from overconfidence. Those who rose quickly believed the absence of the old shadow meant the absence of limitation. They misunderstood what had truly disappeared. It wasn't the threat. It was the warning. Without the warning, missteps multiplied, and missteps accumulated. The system did not collapse dramatically. It thinned. It frayed. It hollowed. Until everything that once felt inevitable began to feel temporary instead. This is the quiet paradox of unrestrained power. It feels limitless, right before it becomes fragile. The city learned to live with that fragility. Accept volatility as rhythm. Rebuild without asking why rebuilding was necessary so often. People adapted the way people always do. By lowering expectations. By shortening trust. By expecting disruption instead of stability. That is how instability becomes permanent, not through destruction, but through normalization. And normalized instability reshapes society far more deeply than any single crisis ever could. The old system had once balanced fear against consequence. The new system chased consequence and mistook survival for success. And in that difference lived the most dangerous illusion of all, that endurance equals control. Over time, the city no longer remembered what stability felt like, not the quiet kind, not the invisible kind, not the kind that worked precisely because it was never announced. Instead, the city remembered only motion. Movement became the new normal. People adjusted not to peace, but to interruption, not to order, but to recovery. Every disruption felt temporary, and every repair felt provisional. Nothing stayed in place long enough to settle into certainty. Certainty had once been the foundation of restraint. Now uncertainty became the default state, and uncertainty reshapes human behavior in subtle, lasting ways. People stop planning far ahead. They stop expecting permanence. They stop trusting what cannot be replaced quickly. Relationships shorten. Agreements become conditional. Loyalty becomes flexible. Survival becomes reactive instead of deliberate. This does not feel like collapse. It feels like adaptation. That is what makes it dangerous. The old architecture of control did not prevent conflict by strength alone. It prevented it by rhythm. Everything moved at a measured pace. Every response had delay built into it. Time itself functioned as a regulator. With that rhythm gone, the city began to move irrhythmically. Surges of activity followed by sudden lulls, unpredictability replacing continuity, and unpredictability breeds defensive behavior. People act sooner, respond faster, strike earlier, because waiting no longer feels safe. The cycle intensified. More reactions created more exposure. More exposure created more pressure. More pressure created more fractures. These fractures did not appear as explosions. They manifested as erosion. Edges softened. Boundaries blurred. Lines dissolved. Until no one could say with confidence where structure ended and improvisation began. And yet, even in this erosion, fragments of the old discipline remained planted in unlikely places. A delayed response here, a paused decision, there a hesitation that no longer had language attached to it, but still existed. These fragments no longer protected entire systems. They protected only individuals, single actors who sensed, without knowing why, that speed carried consequences their environment no longer recognized. They became anomalies, outliers, quiet figures moving against the rhythm of a fast world. And in those quiet figures lived the last living traces of what restraint once meant. But restraint without a surrounding structure feels like weakness. It looks outdated. It draws suspicion. It no longer commands respect on its OW and SO. Even the last fragments began to fade. Not because they failed, but because they no longer fit the tempo of the world around them. The transformation was complete, not marked by a single turning point, not defined by a single collapse, but achieved through gradual abandonment of everything that slowed action. The illusion of control had become louder. The reality of control had become thinner. And this is the final irony of unrestrained power. When everything moves quickly, nothing truly moves with direction. When every moment demands reaction, no moment allows reflection, and without reflection, power becomes momentum without memory. Chapter 15. The man time could not chase. By the time the modern world had fully replaced the one he once mastered, the name Tony Accardo no longer carried weight the way it once had, not because it was forgotten, but because the world had learned to move without waiting for shadows. Time had done what no rival ever truly could. It had rendered absolute power unnecessary. The pace of life accelerated beyond the need for invisible governors. Technology tracked what fear once controlled. Paper trails replaced whispered warnings. Systems replaced intuition. Yet there was something unusual about how his life ended. There was no dramatic downfall, no courtroom spectacle, no public reckoning, no explosive ending. He did not fall. He simply outlasted. While others burned fast under pressure, he drifted quietly beyond it. While successors rose loudly and vanished just as loudly, he remained steady in the background. The world moved around him, not through him. That is a rare fate in any world built on dominance. Most powerful men are destroyed by the very thing that made them powerful, attention. But his strength had never relied on attention. It relied on absence, on silence, on restraint that did not need to explain itself. And so when the end finally approached, it did not arrive as punishment. It arrived as closure. The final years of his life were not lived in fear. They were lived in narrowing circles of familiarity. The world outside grew faster, louder, more exposed. Meanwhile, his own world grew smaller and quieter. Rooms, routine, memory. He no longer needed to read people. He no longer needed to anticipate threats. He no longer needed to calculate outcomes. Time had taken over the job he once performed for himself. And in that handoff between strategy and inevitability, something rare occurred. A man who built his life on control experienced what it meant to let go of it voluntarily. There were no regrets in the dramatic sense that stories prefer. Regret requires comparison. Comparison requires alternative futures. And his life had unfolded exactly along the only path he ever intended it to. Instead, there was acceptance. Acceptance that power never truly belongs to those who hold it. It only borrows their discipline for a while. The city outside kept rewriting itself. New crime, new systems, new methods, new chaos. None of it disturbed the stillness of his final years. The noise of the world had receded to background static. The greatest irony of all was this. For a man who once shaped conflict, the end was not conflict. It was silence. Death arrived not as an enemy, but as an inevitability finally allowed to do its quiet work. There were no final orders, no confessions, no symbolic statements. Just the gradual dimming of a presence the world had already begun to forget how to feel. Yet forgetting is not the same as erasing. What he left behind could not be found in documents, names, or hierarchies that existed only in behavior patterns, in pauses before action, in hesitation before exposure, in instinctive avoidance of theatrical power. The world after him did not understand why certain people still moved with caution. They only knew the caution worked, and that, perhaps, was the most complete ending his life could have achieved. Not legacy in marble, but legacy in motion. After his passing, nothing dramatic changed, no sudden collapse, no violent rebalancing, no visible correction. Because the world he once navigated had already learned to move forward without needing to acknowledge its past. Power had relocated from rooms to systems, from faces to infrastructure, from silence to data. This is how true endings happen, not with interruption, but with irrelevance. The generation that once feared his influence had aged out of fear itself. New generations replaced caution with confidence. They built strategies based on analytics instead of instinct, exposure instead of invisibility, volume instead of subtlety. His absence created no vacuum, only a quiet shift in how control was understood. When historians later tried to chart his impact, they struggled to place him correctly. The measurable record was thin. No speeches, few photographs, almost no traced orders. His life resisted documentation, and yet the behavioral impact remained embedded like sediment beneath the visible layers of modern structure. People still delayed when speed would have exposed them, still avoided escalation when dominance felt tempting, still chose silence over spectacle when spectacle promised only short-term leverage. They had no idea they were repeating someone else's discipline. That is how deep restraint goes when it becomes a surviving instinct instead of a remembered rule. Far from the quiet rooms where he spent his final years, the city continued rewriting itself. Neighborhoods changed. Old borders lost meaning. New commercial corridors replaced forgotten meeting places. People passed daily through spaces where decisions had once been calculated with extreme care and never knew it.to them. These blocks were just pavement.to history. They were pressure points. This transformation is the most complete kind of erasure, not the removal of existence, but the removal of meaning. The memory of force fades faster than the memory of fear, and fear fades faster than the memory of habit. And habit, once detached from its origin, becomes invisible. There is no statue for invisible structure. There is no memorial for restraint. There is no marker for a life spent saying, "not yet," instead of "now." Yet the absence of markers does not mean absence of effect. It simply means the effect became part of the environment. Those who had once studied him most carefully were rarely the ones who spoke about him later. They understood that analysis creates attention, and attention erodes quiet power, even in death. Those who spoke loudest usually understood him least. They wanted the legend without the burden, the authority without the patience, the outcome without the discipline. But discipline is not transferable. It cannot be inherited by name, only by behavior. And behavior weakens when its original pressure disappears. Gradually, even the last behavioral traces began to soften. The final remnants of a silent era blended completely into modern impulse. People no longer delayed because delay no longer made sense in a world built on immediacy. Speed no longer felt dangerous. It felt necessary. This is how the final layer of influence dissolves, not through confrontation, but through redesign. The world rewrote itself into something his instincts would not have recognized, and that was the truest sign that the era had finally ended. In the end, the story does not close with a headline. It doesn't conclude with sirens or verdicts or spectacled. It fades the way all long dominions truly fade, into behavior so ordinary that no one remembers it was ever taught. That is the final shape of influence. Long after the name Tony Accardo slipped from daily conversation, the reflexes he embedded still moved within people who never knew his face. They did not call it caution. They did not recognize it as discipline. They simply felt an instinct to pause when others rushed, to reconsider when others charged forward, to remain quiet when attention tempted. And because those instincts worked, they survived. not as doctrine, not as legacy, but as muscle memory. This is what separates loud power from lasting power. Loud power leaves stories. Lasting power leaves structure. Stories excite for a moment. Structure reshapes generations. When people speak about dominance, they often imagine force. They think of commands, threats, takeovers, and visible authority. But the most enduring form of control rarely announces itself. It changes the way people behave when no one is watching. It teaches restraint without requiring explanation. It shapes decision-making without ever demanding loyalty. That is why this story cannot be reduced to simple rise and fall. That it does not follow the rhythm of ascent and collapse. That it follows the rhythm of containment. Expansion controlled by pause. Ambition slowed by hesitation. Violence prevented by the anticipation of consequences before they ever needed to occur. Modern power rarely understands this language. That it operates on exposure, that on immediacy, that on reactions measured in seconds instead of years. And because of that, modern power burns faster than it builds. That it achieves faster, and it fractures faster. The world now moves in cycles measured by attention instead of endurance. It values disruption more than continuity. It rewards visibility more than survival. And in that environment, the old mathematics of restraint feels foreign, even unnecessary. Yet when instability stacks too high, when disruption becomes exhausting instead of exciting, the instinct to slow down always returns. People rediscover caution without knowing they are rediscovering history. They pause before escalation. They hesitate before exposure. They choose delay over dominance. And they believe the choice is their own. This is how influence becomes invisible. It no longer needs to be credited. It simply reappears when conditions demand it. The man himself has long since passed beyond consequence, beyond reputation, beyond judgment. What remains is not a life, but a pattern, woven so deeply into the hidden logic of survival that it no longer requires a name. That is the paradox of the quietest rulers. They disappear completely, and yet they never fully leave, because what they truly controlled was never territory or hierarchy or even fear. What they controlled was rhythm. And rhythm is the hardest thing to erase from human behavior. The final image is not of power ending. It is of the world continuing, shaped by forces it no longer remembers. Learning from a pause before a decision, a delay before a reaction, a restraint that arrives without explanation. This is the final trace of a man who outsmarted the law not by defeating it, but by teaching the world to move slowly enough that it never needed to chase him. And now, as the noise of the modern world settles back into the background, the lesson remains quietly at work, in timing, in silence, in hesitation, unseen, uncelebrated, unending.